Hi, welcome back guys. This is your friend, Fanfiction Guy. Back with amazing fanfiction. This is the series of What If Deku Had Third Eye Quirk. Now before starting, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. It was just another spring day at the local kindergarten. The sound of children's laughter rang loudly in the air. The sky was a crystal blue and the sun was shining down proudly, basking everybody in its golden rays. Nothing seemed to be out of the ordinary. Upon closer inspection, a green-haired boy could be seen quivering, defending a cowering kid as three more powerful students sneered down at him. The standoff and subsequent silence seemed to last a few seconds before someone got impatient. "Get out of my way!" An ash-blonde kid shrieked, causing the small form of Izuku Midoriya to shake harder than he'd been seconds earlier. Despite the fear, he stood his ground. "See, can't you see, you're hurting him, Kaken?" Izuku felt terrified but proud. He'd actually been able to stand up for someone, like All Might. He turned to smile at the poor boy the trio had been beating up only to see an empty space where the other kid had been crying. He inwardly sighed. Of course he was left alone again. It was then that Bakugo and his lackeys made their approach, quirks activated and sparks flying off of the blonde's hands. "You think you can just talk to me like that?" His face twisted into a demonic snarl. "Look, you're even shaking in your boots, you're so scared of me." Bakugo's followers cackled from behind him, jeering at the weaker child as they all started beating him up mercilessly. Suffice to say, Izuku Midoriya left preschool that day even worse off than he usually was. When Inko, his mother, arrived to pick him up, he didn't say a word though. She didn't need to know how mean Kaken was being after all. They were still friends, he convinced himself. He'd probably just upset him somehow, yeah. They'd make up soon and then become the best pro-heroes ever together. "How's my little Izu's day been?" She crushed the boy in a bear hug as he stuttered out a response. "I'm fine, Mum. I've had a good day." With those words he broke into a smile which was just as radiant as the sun. Inko felt relief wash over her and smiled back. It was wonderful to see her son so happy. Although she truly was interested in learning about Izuku's day, she was a lot more worried about him than she would want to admit. She was afraid the other kids would hurt him just because he'd been diagnosed quirkless a few days ago. She was scared he would be sad he could never be a hero like his idol All Might, but she had no need to worry. Her little boy was taking it all in his stride, and from the sounds of things, the other children were still extremely nice to him. Especially Mitsuki's son. She'd have to invite them both over sometime. The smile on her son's face put all her worries to rest. She felt content when he smiled like that. She decided then that she didn't mind if he was quirkless or couldn't become a hero. As long as he kept smiling, she knew he would be fine and she'd never have to worry. "I'm fine." Those were the two words Izuku found himself repeating again and again to his mother, to his father every time he called from overseas, to Aunt Mitsuki every time she asked. Hell, he even repeated it like a mantra to himself until he believed it. Somewhere, deep down inside of him, he knew he was lying to everyone though. It had been 5 years since he'd been friends with Katsuki and the boy was his biggest bully. The words he spat every time they spoke hurt. They stung and wouldn't leave him alone. The only thing he could think of that was worse was the physical pain, being beaten and bruised every day for no reason. His days went something along the lines of, wake up way too early, watch hero videos, get ready for hell, school, class, otherwise known as the perfect time to get taunted by the teachers and his peers, get his lunch stolen, and after school, he'd get beaten up by Bakugo and his lackeys before hurrying home to get there before his mother and then having dinner and going to bed. Then repeat. The cycle had been going on for years. Izuku and Katsuki were both 9. Izuku knew he was getting tired. He honestly didn't know how long he could keep the act up and he was starting to lose hope, but he was fine. He continued convincing himself and those around him. It was fine. Izuku was walking stealthily through the corridors one evening after school. His head was held low and he was avoiding his bullies with the kind of skill only gained from years of experience. He'd been about to walk out via the office gate when he'd looked up at the notice board out of habit and froze. On the board there was always a range of documents, useless pieces of information that Izuku never failed to read. Now, a single bold and colorful poster adorned the wall. All Might. On July 15th, the number 1 hero, All Might, will be paying a delightful visit to our prestigious school. He will give the whole school a talk about what it means to be a hero, and after that there'll be an opportunity for autographs and one-to-one talks with the number 1 himself. We expect you all to be on your best behavior. So, Izuku couldn't believe what he was reading. Unbridled joy bloomed in his chest, and he felt his eyes welled up with happy tears. July the 15th, that's my birthday. I'll finally get to meet him. I'll ask him then. I'll ask him if quirkless people can become heroes. He's saved thousands of people. Maybe he can save me too, he whispered to himself, a soft smile on his lips as the last of his tears ran down his face. Unbeknownst to the green-haired boy, there was someone watching him as he left. Somebody lurking in the shadows behind the door, listening to his every word. Katsuki Bakugo frowned. He'd been about to call out to the nerd when he'd heard Deku mumbling. It was one of the many things he hated about the boy, but he listened in. Once he'd caught wind of what the greenette was saying, he had to fight not to gasp and give himself away. All Might was coming to this shitty school? He was shocked but excited at the same time. He'd finally have a chance to make the damn extras really eat his dust. Meeting All Might would be his first stepping stone towards UA. After Izuku left the building, Katsuki went to look at the poster for himself, and sure enough, everything Deku had said was true. The blonde was elated until he read the date that the event was taking place on. His eyes instantly narrowed. July the 15th, the damn nerd's birthday. Teasage, Deku better not get the wrong idea, because if he thinks he can be a hero just because he met All Might, wait, what if he doesn't meet All Might? He spoke softly, a wicked grin spreading across his face as he formulated a plan. He left the school smirking. The damn nerd won't know what hit him. Izuku arrived home bruised, as he was every night. He wasn't safe just because Bakugo hadn't found him. The minute he'd stepped out of the building, he had been jumped by some older kids and Katsuki's lackeys. The same old insults were thrown at him. He can't do anything right. Such a waste of space. Quirkless losers don't belong here. What a worthless Deku. He was beaten up just as on any other day, and yet he was still content. The news of the symbol of peace coming to his school had put the boy into a happy trance. That evening, Inko looked at her son and felt at peace. The second she'd arrived home, she'd been greeted by a storm of muttering, and through this, she'd learnt All Might would be visiting her baby and his friends. She was truly happy for him. He'd seemed sadder recently, although he never failed to smile for her. He said he was fine and she wanted to believe her son, but she was worried. It had taken a while, but eventually, she'd realized he never seemed to play with any of the other kids or even invite Katsuki over. Maybe seeing All Might would cheer him up again, motivate him. And if the symbol of peace really couldn't help him, well, if she'd do it herself, she'd go to hell and back to R. Izuku said goodnight to his mother and went to bed early that night, not for the sake of sleep but because he needed time to think. He had about 2 weeks until the big day, and he needed to prepare himself mentally at the very least. He knew he couldn't have a fanboy breakdown and faint the second he saw the number 1. He'd lose his chance to ask his question. Izuku decided to take up meditation. He'd read online that some heroes do it and it helps to strengthen your mind. He would go beyond. The greenette sat on the ground, legs crossed, and tried to clear his mind. He felt his thoughts slowing down and his muscles relaxing. It was working. 2 weeks quickly became 1, then 2 days, and finally it was July 14th, the night before the big day. Don't stay up too late, Izu. Inko called. Remember, it's an important day for more than one reason tomorrow. As the days passed by, Inko had found herself becoming more and more excited for the 15th, but she also couldn't help her anxiety. She was worried about how things would go if All Might wasn't as good of a role model as she thought, or if the school brought in an actor instead of the man himself. Her baby would be distraught. In addition to that, at work, she had a huge court case which would hopefully come to a conclusion tomorrow, and it was stressing her out. She consciously made an effort to file away her nerves and stay positive though, not for herself but for her little Izu. Izuku called back down from the top of the stairs, "I will, Mom, love you." The greenette was absolutely ecstatic, barely able to hold still for a second and quite literally jumping around from wall to wall like a certain old hero. He eventually stopped himself and meditated. Since his first attempt, he'd been getting considerably better, to the point where the meditation was actually helping him. Izuku felt his thoughts slowing, he felt himself calming down, and it was nice. In all honesty, the boy couldn't wait, but he forced himself to go to bed. Tomorrow was going to be a good day. July 15th, Kitsahara Elementary. Half an hour more. Just one more half hour of torture before he would finally get to see All Might in the flesh. He could do it. Bakugo looked up from his seat across the classroom and scowled. He'd finished the work the stupid teacher had set in 5 minutes flat while all the other extras were struggling. The only exception being the damn nerd who was sitting up in his seat, finished work in hand, grinning like a damn idiot. It pissed him off. None of the other students knew it was Deku's birthday today. There was no reason for them to, but the idiot hadn't smiled like that on his birthday, or any day for that matter, in years. He smirked. It was only a matter of time until he wiped that infuriating smile right off of the nerd's face. 10 minutes until All Might. Izuku got up from his seat. He needed some cold water on his face, a toilet break and meditation to calm down his nerves. He was excused by the teacher and ran out of the classroom into the toilets to prepare himself. Little did he know, a certain ash blonde was following suit. Izuku stood in front of a mirror looking at himself and smiling. He was 10, and for the first time in a while he felt truly happy. The green-haired boy walked into one of the toilet stalls and locked himself in before suddenly. A scraping noise followed the sound of the explosion, and only after that did Bakugo speak. If you really thought I was going to let a damn worthless Deku like you talk to All Might, you're more stupid than I thought. Izuku tried to open the stall's door, but he had no success. The heat of the explosion had completely messed up the lock system, and there was something under the handle on the other side for good measure. What an idiot, Katsuki sneered as he walked out of the toilets laughing. 7 minutes until All Might. As Bakugo's steps faded away, Izuku felt his cheeks dampen. A fountain of tears flowed down his face. He really hates me that much, huh? A wide range of emotions clouded the boy's vision as he started losing hope again. His one chance had been stolen away from him. Everything hurt him and the world seemed to hate him. Maybe he should just give up. His mum would come to school when she realized he wasn't home yet. At least she cared. 5 minutes until All Might. Izuku started to feel something new, something that had been there all along. He started to feel anger. He felt angry about how he was quirkless. He felt angry about how not everyone was made equal. He felt angry about all the bullying he had to go through every day, angry about how he could never become a hero. He was shaking, but not out of fear for once, out of pure rage. He clawed his way out from under the stall's door. It hurt as the space was so small, but he just about managed to wriggle out before he stood. When he looked back at the door, the sight he saw only made him angrier. The lock had melted under the force of Kaken's explosion, and a broom had been forced under it. He turned away from the door and looked in the mirror. His usually calm face was a mask of unbridled fury, and all that did was rile him up more. One thought played in his mind on repeat. This is their fault, this is their fault, this is their fault, this is their fault. 3 minutes until All Might. He was running through the corridors towards his classroom, a new strength powering through him. Is this how Kaken feels every day? He wondered as his hand pushed down on the handle and he slammed the door open. Everyone in the class froze, staring at him. Most of his classmates looked afraid, some looked worried, but the thing that ticked him off the most, the jaw-dropped expression on Kaken's face. You know, guys, you've all been playing games with me for years. Not a single one of you ever passed up on a chance to bring pain. He spat, venom behind his every word. Izuku grinned, seeing red, feeling the rage consume him. I think it's about time that I took my turn, don't you think? Bakugo's POV. I think it's about time that I took my turn, don't you think? Shit, the damn nerd was supposed to stay locked up until after the event. Deku suddenly moved, and before anyone could say a word, a loud cracking sound filled the silent room. I looked over to see Deku standing over a bleeding kid, my friend Tsubasa, I realized, who seemed to be slumped against the wall out cold. The crack was probably his head, my brain very unhelpfully supplied. I winced slightly at that. Definitely a serious concussion in his near future. Geez, I know the kid was an idiot and a bully, but that was too extreme. I wanted to shout. For a second, there was silence. And then there was chaos in every sense of the word. The idiot teachers started shrieking at all of us to run while some of the other damn extras were frozen or crying. Deku was smiling, but it wasn't that stupid smile from earlier. No, it was crazed and feral. Everywhere, there was the sound of bones breaking, people screaming, kids crying about their friends, and the cause of it all was the stupid, weak, quirkless boy that we all beat up for fun. All I could do was watch, frozen as my classmates fell around me, dropping one by one like fleas. In seemingly no time at all, everyone was down. He'd fought everyone except the teacher and won. I give you permission to use your quirks. The teacher yelled as he fell to the ground, and that's all it took to get me out of my stupor. Useless idiot, they were all using their quirks anyway. Deku, I'll end you. I yelled and rushed forward towards the nerd. 1 minute until All Might. 19 down, 1 to go, he whispered softly. And that's as far as you'll get. I screamed. I felt the familiar heat rise up in my hands as I began to sweat more and more before. Boom. The force of the explosion shook the whole room. That explosion should have been more than enough to end the nerd. The smoke cleared and what I expected to see was Deku on the ground out cold. What I did see was red as I felt my arm crack and a burning pain shoot through it. I rotated on my heel only to see him swing and punch me in the stomach. True pain. A punch from his noodle arms shouldn't be that strong. I wanted to scream. Oh, hello Kaken. I almost froze. The way he said it was sweet and yet so poisonous. His emerald eyes flashed with something that looked like endless intent. That wasn't there when he was attacking the others. It made my stomach drop that much more and honestly scared me. You know, it's not very nice to attack people like that. He gave me a lopsided grin. Did it make him look crazy? Yes. Did I want to run? Hell yes. How does it feel to be afraid? Shut up. I shouted. Instead of focusing on his face, I honed in on his movements and managed to dodge him. I've got all the power now, KAACCCN, he sang. The way he was talking made me shudder. I wanted to get the hell out, but I stood my ground. Ignore him, ignore the fear. Duck and dodge, Katsuki, just duck and dodge, I told myself. How does it feel to finally be on the losing side of the game? A jab to my side and I ducked. How does it feel to be the hunted instead of the hunter? An punch aimed at my stomach which I sidestepped. How does it feel to be nothing more than a worthless Deku? He shrieked, a barrage of punches and kicks following. I twisted and ducked, using my good arm to create explosions, giving me a little more mobility. I evaded the next jab and the next and so on, until I was backed up against a wall. Of course there was something else he was doing. I cursed myself. Even if the nerd is on a rampage, of course he still has at least a bit of strategy. That's exactly what he uses that damn notebook for. I thought you were supposed to be good at this game. He paused, frowning at me before his grin widened and his eyes seemed to glow a toxic green, madness dancing behind them. I guess I just play it better. He lifted his arm and I knew what was coming. I tried to duck under his fist, but it was futile. He punched me in the face. I tried to create an explosion with my unbroken arm, but before I could do anything, he yanked down on said arm with such force that it cracked and shattered under the pressure. He punched me again and again and again while all I could do was scream in pain. Weak, you really weren't even strong enough to beat quirkless Izuku? I thought as I started seeing black borders at the edges of my vision. Damn, now that I think about it, even the teacher wasn't strong enough to beat Deku? What the hell is he? I could hear him giggling like a damn maniac, but I could feel his tears dropping onto my bruised body. Before blacking out, one thought entered my head. God, I can't let the nerd become a villain. Third person. When Bakugo collapsed, Izuku froze before looking up and laughing like he hadn't a care in the world. As he laughed the pain away, the objects in the room started to twitch and float up until all that remained on the ground was the passed-out bodies of his classmates and teacher. Izuku didn't even notice. His laughter changed, becoming more manic, hysterical, and the objects spun around the room, getting faster and faster and faster, forming figures of eights and chaotic patterns until... I am here. Sorry to be Eladash. All Might froze and so did Izuku. The number one hero looked into toxic green eyes and Izuku gasped, trying to breathe before he screamed and collapsed. When he fell, everything in the room fell with him and a loud crash resounded throughout the school. All Might could only stand shocked. What in the world had just happened? Izuku Midoriya had been in the middle of one of the biggest court cases in her life, defending her client like a champ, when her phone had gone off rather unexpectedly and she'd been forced to excuse herself, putting the trial on hold. She'd been ready to bite the head off of whoever had called her during working hours, but stopped cold when she realized the caller ID belonged to none other than Kitsuhara Elementary, her son's school. She picked up in seconds. "Mrs. Midoriya, please come to the school as soon as possible. The principal needs to talk to you regarding your son Midoriya Izuku." Upon hearing those words, a feeling of dread crept onto her and settled over her heart. She had a precognition that something had gone terribly wrong. When she hurried back into the courtroom and told the audience, judge and jury, she would be unable to continue with the trial due to unforeseen circumstances, the look on her face was enough for them to pardon her from having to participate. With the pardon and supportive words of her coworkers in her head, she hurried out of the building. Half an hour and a lot of stress tears later, Izuku had arrived at the school. Her face instantly paled once she noticed the 10 ambulances and 36 or so parents on campus. If she wasn't stressed out before, she certainly was stressed out now. The green-haired woman had started trembling, then crying, when she suddenly felt a warm hand on her shoulder. Turning around, she saw none other than her best friend Mitsuki Bakugo looking her straight in the eyes. The blonde looked solemn, but there was a determined sparkle behind her eyes that soothed Izuku. She managed to calm herself down, and the two friends began discussing the likelihood of something bad actually happening. Once the ambulances had left for the hospital, the parents were all called into the hall to speak with the principal. The 36 adults all walked in silence, every single one of them praying for their children's safety. The principal stood up from his seat and spoke, his voice echoing around the hall. "It's to my great displeasure that I must deliver the news that 20 students and 1 teacher have been admitted to hospital today." There was a collective gasp from the parents, and murmurs started rumbling throughout the hall. All of their children had been hospitalized. "Rest assured, none of the children have fatal or permanent injuries," the head teacher continued. "And now we have someone who will hopefully give you more information about the situation at hand. I am here to tell you about today's events." The normally comforting declaration was anything but. "As the principal has stated, none of your children have life-threatening or permanent injuries. However, every single child as well as their teacher seems to be suffering from broken bones and injuries ranging from mild to severe." This news was somewhat reassuring, nowhere near reassuring enough, but somewhat reassuring. At least there was nothing permanent. "Now, I'll tell you everything I know," All Might started solemnly. "I was making my way to see the young children when I took a detour which held me up for exactly a minute. When I arrived at the classroom, I opened the door only to see a green-haired boy with toxic green eyes staring at me before collapsing. When the boy collapsed, all the objects in the classroom, which had been floating, fell to the ground, which leads me to believe the young man was using his quirk." "Izuku!" Izuku gasped. "After all these years? It would make sense. I do have a weaker telekinesis quirk after all. But why was he announced quirkless then? Was the doctor lying or doing his job wrong? Should I sue? Does Izuku know he has a quirk yet?" Mitsuki shook her head at her best friend's muttering. It was a habit the green-haired woman had had since they'd met all the way back in junior high. "Snap out of it, Izuku." She laughed quietly as she hit her friend over the back of the head. "Sorry," Izuku replied sheepishly. Unfortunately, a table fell on top of the young man and crushed him, injuring him a fair amount. I proceeded to pull him out before looking around the classroom, only to find every single student and even the teacher knocked out and injured fairly severely. It was quite off-putting. Many of the parents started whispering amongst themselves again, but Izuku was trembling in her seat. A table had fallen on her baby. Was he okay? They did say that none of the children were fatally injured or had permanent damage, but she still couldn't help but worry. Mitsuki was worried as well, though she hid it better. She knew the brat would pull through. She spoke soft, reassuring words to her friend and rubbed circles into her back until they both felt a bit calmer. The blonde man told them the rest of his story, how he'd called ambulances and the police before informing the principal and office, who'd made calls to the parents. There was surprisingly little information, This fact in itself was unsettling for a majority of the parents in the room, but no one said anything. All of the people involved will be questioned by a detective friend of mine when they're awake, and we will come to a fair ruling on the incident. You may leave now to go see your children. They were all surprised to hear All Might speak somewhat calmly rather than shouting, and everyone could hear the note of regret that tinged his voice. The parents all stood in a show of solidarity despite the grave atmosphere which had settled over the room. They then began making their way outside and starting their individual journeys towards the hospital. Izuku's POV. I woke up to the smell of antiseptics. Realizing I was on a hospital bed, I tried to move and I was fairly successful, until I realized my left leg refused to swing with my right one. I looked back only to see my left ankle wrapped tightly in bandages. Broken. Sighing, I shuffled back into my previous position and began to think and ask questions. Why would I be in a hospital? I don't remember any events that would put me here. Oh God. Small flashes, nothing much, but glimpses, and even the few seconds of what I saw myself doing was enough to make me feel ill. That wasn't me, was it? It wasn't real life. It must have been just a dream. Yeah, it was just a dream. I laughed shakily, finding it harder and harder to breathe. I brought my hand to my face and could feel a stream of tears making their way down my cheeks and pooling onto my blanket. It was getting even harder to breathe. I was shaking. No air. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't make a sound. Gasping for breath, I found I was choking on nothing at all. There was so much fear and anxiety. What's happening to me? The edges of my vision started turning black. I think I'm dying. Maybe I deserve to die after what I did. I hurt them all so much. I couldn't stop the thoughts flying through my head, and each thought just seemed to scare me more, and the more fear I felt, the harder it was to breathe until... Stop it and breathe, you damn nerd. Kaken shouted from the bed next to mine. He genuinely sounded worried, and the madness stopped. His voice was like an anchor which I grabbed onto as it dragged me out of the darkness and back into reality. Thank you, I stuttered out, managing to gulp in some air. This doesn't mean anything, Deku. He snapped back. I sighed, at least I'm not dying. I turned to my head around to see the entirety of my class in hospital beds. Everyone seemed to have bandages, casts, or both, and they were all looking at me fearfully. I did do this, didn't I? The thought was unwelcome, but I needed to deal with it. I had to push through. Sorry, I whispered just loud enough for everyone to hear. My apology fell upon deaf ears. I could hear footsteps outside, not a pair but a whole army, and my guess was that it was our parents. Sure enough, less than a minute later, a line of crying adults entered the room, and at the head of the line, Mum. I could see the tears glistening in her eyes, and I could only imagine the amount of stress she'd gone through. I could almost visualize the amount of new gray hairs she'd been gifted just from today's events. I looked at the clock and realized something. She'd been at work. She'd been talking about a huge case which she'd hopefully be able to wrap up today for weeks. I looked back at my mother, tears in my eyes and guilt in my gut. It was then I decided that I was done with lying. I would tell her everything. Inko's POV. I looked at Izuku and a sigh of relief escaped my lips. Other than a cast on his left arm and some bandages on his left ankle, he seemed to be all right. There were probably some bruises here and there, but those would heal. I rushed over to Izu and enveloped him in a bear hug, but jerked back when I felt him wince from the pain. His arm. I mentally scolded myself. I completely forgot. I didn't even notice I was crying until Izuku hugged me. Mom, please don't cry, I'm so sorry, he sobbed. I controlled my breathing and stopped the tears. I needed to be strong for my baby. Don't be sorry, it's not your fault. I tried to reassure him, but it only seemed to make things worse. But it was my fault, he whispered back. I think I need to talk to you about something. He paused, looking at all the people around us. In private? I sighed again. He should be resting. Whatever it was seemed important though. He started to lift himself out of the bed, but his left ankle seemed to be letting him down. I helped him get the rest of the way out and supported him as we walked out of the injured ward and into a vacant coffee room. We sat down at a table facing each other. Mom, he started. Ever since I was 4 and announced, Quirkless, I've been bullied. He looked down at the ground before continuing. Every day since then I've been hiding everything from you because I didn't want to bother you or get the others in trouble. Baby, you could have told me, you would never have been a bother. I almost spoke but I let him continue. Now that he'd started, I didn't want to shut him down. Whenever I came home and you'd ask me where I got all the scrapes and bruises from, I always lied. It wasn't from me tripping over or accidentally catching myself on things, it was from the others beating me up every night. I started crying then. I had had suspicions but Izu was naturally clumsy and I knew I worried too much. I'd let it all go, assumed he would tell me if there was anything wrong. He carried on. They only beat me after school though, the rest of the time they hurt me with their words. As far as they're concerned, I'm literally the scum of the earth. Most of them don't even know my real name, I'm just worthless Deku. He laughed but instead of joy-filled as it usually was it sounded mirthless and dead. The sound physically pained me. Today I was going to ask All Might if quirkless people can become heroes. I almost gasped. He never did let go of his dreams and now that he did have a quirk, they could finally come true. I left the classroom about 10 minutes before All Might was supposed to arrive and went into the toilets, locking myself in a stall. I had a vague idea of where the story was going at least for a little bit. A certain explosion prick then proceeded to storm in, melt the lock system of my stall and stuff a broom under the handle, trapping me and stopping me from having any opportunity to see All Might. Anger seemed to flicker across his face before he schooled his features back into a calm expression. That revelation was shocking. I had guessed he had been locked in the moment he mentioned he was bullied and entering the stall. But Katsuki did it? I felt extremely angry on behalf of my son. Mitsuki and I are definitely going to have words after this. I cried and I almost gave up and let it happen. I knew you would find me eventually. I appreciated the fact that he knew I would always be there for him, but the melancholic way in which he stated it did little more than upset me. That was until I began thinking about everything and the unfairness of it all, then I saw red. And the next thing I know, I'm in a hospital bed with my entire class around me. The implications of what he was saying hit me in the face. He really was the reason why they were all here, and yet he wasn't. He'd literally been pushed to the point of releasing years of pent-up rage and frustration. He could barely even remember exactly what he did. I know it was me, there's no other logical explanation. If they didn't hate me before then they'll definitely hate me now. He smiled again. Anyway, it doesn't matter. The others will probably all say I'm a psycho or a villain, and with this on my record, I'll never be able to become a hero. I'm quirkless anyway, so I doubt it was going to happen. That's when I decided to say something. Izuku, none of this is your fault. I know me saying this won't stop you from feeling guilty, but it's the truth. You were bullied for years and you didn't tell a soul. You kept all of that fear and sadness and frustration to yourself instead of sharing the burden. Anyone would snap if they had to go through what you did. I could hear him sobbing quietly, but I carried on. All Might found you just before you collapsed. He said that your eyes were a toxic green and all the furniture in the room was floating around, everyone else was passed out. Izuku looked at me confused before his eyes widened in realization. You do have a quirk, Izuku, you'll be able to become a hero and I'll support you every step of the way. I'm sorry that I couldn't be there for you before, but I'll go beyond this time. I flashed him a watery smile. Plus ultra. He whispered and tackled me in a hug, gritting his teeth at the pain in his arm but sporting the brightest smile I'd ever seen. We cried together, tears of happiness and sadness before we left the hospital and made our way back home. Third-person POV. 2 days after being discharged from the hospital, Izuku was called into the police station for questioning. He and Inko sat in the waiting room waiting for the detective they were supposed to talk to call them in when suddenly, I am here to have a one-to-one talk with Midoriya Izuku. Over the past day, All Might had been having his one-to-one talks with all of the injured students. They all seemed to cheer up when he spoke to them and he'd had some very nice chats. In all honesty, he was rather worried about how this one would go considering last time he'd seen the greenette, the boy had screamed and fainted. Hello all Might, Izuku stammered. I'll leave you two to talk, Inko chuckled. All Might nodded in her direction as she left the room. How are you, my boy? I think MF fine, Izuku managed to reply. Oh, I'm glad to hear that, young Midoriya, All Might laughed. Do you have any questions you want to ask or anything you want to say? It's not really relevant anymore but it's still an important question I think. Do why you think quirkless people can become heroes? All Might thought for a second before he responded. No, young man, I don't believe quirkless people can become heroes. It'd be too big of a disadvantage and they'd probably become a liability in battle. I'm sure with a quirk like yours you could become a great hero though. When he heard All Might's answer, Izuku felt some of his respect for the man disappear. I was quirkless until the first time you saw me, All Might, he retorted flatly. Oh, All Might instantly felt regretful for his choice of words, but before he could respond. Izuku Midoriya, Detective Tsukachi is ready to see you now. Tsukachi, I love you but god darn it, could you have picked a worse time? All Might wanted to scream as Midoriya walked away from him. Of course there was a reason young Midoriya asked the question. If he'd answered like that a week ago, he would have crushed the boy's dreams. All Might lowered his head, shame and remorse running rampant through him. The next time he saw a young Midoriya, he'd apologize, he promised himself. After all the witness interrogations have been completed, Tsukachi, the principal and All Might sat around a small table. Once all three of them had settled, Tsukachi began to speak. We've finally been able to gather accounts from everyone that was present and we have a fair amount of knowledge about what happened on July the 15th at Kitsuhara Elementary. The other two men nodded, so he continued. Izuku Midoriya entered the classroom about 3 minutes before you were due to arrive, All Might, and proceeded to beat up all of his classmates as well as his teacher before he unlocked his quirk and collapsed upon your arrival. The news shocked both of the other two present. Neither of them had been informed of what had actually happened that day. But young Midoriya seemed so. All Might was unable to put his thoughts into words. Innocent felt like the closest word to what he was looking for, and yet, when he looked into the boy's eyes, he knew that description was wrong. Expulsion is the only suitable punishment for such a crime. The principal exclaimed, excited. He'd been waiting for an excuse to expel the quirkless boy for years. Now that one had arrived, he was going to grab it with both hands. Naomasa and Toshinori both looked at the principal in disgust before Naomasa spoke again. It would seem like that, but you have to acknowledge the circumstances behind the situation. Midoriya was bullied by his peers for years. He was physically and verbally abused by his classmates as well as his teacher every day. All Might froze, shocked, and the principal paled considerably, bearing a crestfallen expression before he quickly smoothed over his face, something that didn't go unnoticed by Tsukachi. Every single student as well as their teacher lied about close to everything that happened that day. I only got 2 truthful accounts. Those of Midoriya Izuku and Bakugo Katsuki. The principal seemed to sag in his seat at the detective's words. A major event happened before the chaos that ensued that afternoon. Midoriya went to the toilets to prepare himself for seeing you, All Might, as admittedly, he's been a fan of yours since age 2. All Might felt his stomach drop at that and the overwhelming guilt coming back. Bakugo trapped him in a stall, illegally using his quirk and stuffing a broom under the handle before leaving Midoriya alone just so he would be unable to see you. All Might was surprised to hear that. He understood young Bakugo had anger issues, but this seemed extreme, even for him. The principal looked like he wanted to vanish. He was aware of the bullying, but would this go on his #1 student's record? Midoriya got upset, then angry, and couldn't remember what happened next, but Bakugo was able to recount Midoriya coming into the room and knocking out everyone in his class. In conclusion, I would have to say that everyone in that classroom was to blame for the incident that occurred. However, there's one more person who I think we can hold responsible. Tsukachi's brown eyes flashed golden as his quirk activated. Mr. Principal, were you aware of the bullying that was taking place at your school? No, the principal replied coolly. Tsukachi's left eye twitched. He's lying. He sighed to himself but carried on the interrogation. Did you have any ill intent towards Midoriya simply for his quirkless status? No, I accept the quirkless with open arms. They're important to our society. Another lie, another twitch of the detective's left eye. Were you going to expel Midoriya because you wanted to or because you felt the need to? Obviously because I felt it was necessary to take precautions for the safety of my other students. The lies just kept rolling off of his tongue. May I ask, Did you ever partake in the bullying and shaming of Midoriya? Of course not. How you could accuse me of such a thing is preposterous, the head teacher screamed and Tsukachi's eye twitched. All Might watched the scene and only felt his contempt for the man grow. He'd even bullied one of the students he was tasked with protecting. That was one fact that made him feel ill. Toshinori was aware of Naomesa's tell after all, they'd been working together for years. He genuinely felt bad for his friend as he watched the amount of times his eye twitched during the interrogation. It was something the detective couldn't control. Every time he heard a lie, that little twitch would happen. That must be really painful, he chuckled to himself silently. The interrogation continued in much the same manner until finally, Tsukachi deactivated his quirk and announced that he was definitely going to arrest the man on child abuse charges if the family wanted to press them. One way you could try to save your sorry hind is by actually doing one good deed and punishing your students fairly. Tsukachi spoke in a monotone, but All Might could feel the rage behind his words. Eventually, they reached the agreement that Bakugo and Midoriya would both be suspended for 2 weeks. The rest of the class would be suspended for 1 week for their part in the bullying, and he as well as the class teacher would have their teaching licenses revoked. All Might and Detective Tsukachi left the police station feeling content with their work that afternoon, while the principal left distraught that just like that, he'd lost his job. 1 week of suspension to go. It was 2 o'clock in the morning. Izuku Midoriya was running purely on coffee, determination, and love for her son. She'd been doing so for the past week. Ever since the incident, she'd been doing everything she possibly could to cheer up Izuku as well as help him to fend off his bullies and start him on training to become a hero. She'd actually been pretty successful. Not long after she'd started searching for ways to help her son defend himself, she'd come across an old and well-known dojo which wasn't too far away. It supposedly believed in strengthening both the user and the quirk, so she'd had close to no qualms about signing him up. Izuku had also begun to teach Izuku how to use his quirk. It was pretty similar to hers but a lot more powerful from what she'd seen of it. The green-haired woman hummed to herself deep in thought. Whenever her son used his quirk, something always felt off. She couldn't put her finger on exactly what it was, but she knew there was something. She sighed and tried to brush aside her worries, knowing that if there really was anything wrong, the two of them would figure it out together. In regards to Izuku's happiness, she felt she wasn't doing too badly. After they'd returned home from his interrogation with Detective Tsukachi, they'd gone out for dinner, a belated birthday treat as he'd had to rest due to his injuries on the actual day. When they'd finished the meal, Izuku had ordered katsudon. Izuku had presented a few gifts to her son. A sleek emerald notebook which he could use to make notes on his own quirk, the dojo membership pass, and a large box of chocolates. The younger Midoriya had been absolutely ecstatic then and was still in what Izuku liked to call a happy haze days later. His suspension from school had been a bit difficult to deal with as, despite the bullying that school often meant, Izuku loved knowledge. He seemed to feel a lot better though once she mentioned that all of his classmates were getting suspended as well, including Katsuki. She made a mental note that she still needed to speak with Mitsuki about Kaken. All in all though, things were running pretty smoothly except maybe her sleeping patterns. Izuku stood up from her chair and shut down her laptop before clambering into bed. Tomorrow was going to be Aiza's first day at the dojo and she could not afford to oversleep and let her son miss out on something so important to him. Izuku's POV. 6 days of suspension to go. This morning, I woke up early. Not for any reason in particular but out of habit. It was so odd not being at school. I couldn't help but think about how most of the class would be back by now, gaining more knowledge and maybe even learning interesting things about quirks. That thought made me want to crawl back under the covers and cry, but instead, I steadied myself and went down the stairs to greet Mom. The kitchen was empty, which was unusual. Normally Mom was in the kitchen in the mornings. I went back up to her room and she wasn't there either. Starting to panic, I searched through most of the rooms in the house wondering if a villain had attacked during the night when I finally came to the last room, the living room. I almost called Detective Tsukachi. He'd given me his number after I'd been interrogated, but that's when I saw it. Sitting innocently on the table, a note. I hope you slept well. I came to wake you up but you looked so peaceful that I couldn't bring myself to. I'm really sorry that I didn't tell you before I left, but the office just called in for an impromptu hearing. Don't worry though, Hopefully I can get away quickly before your class starts and return to work after walking you there. We can also get ice cream afterwards. Oh yeah, I almost forgot, it's my first lesson today. There's some cold soba you can eat in the fridge and I'll probably be back around 7 o'clock. Love you lots. I looked behind my shoulder at the old clock mounted on the wall. It read 6:55. With that information in mind, my panicked searching quickly became panicked dashing, trying to get myself ready for the day. Everything seemed to be going everywhere as I rushed between rooms, becoming the ultimate multitasker and doing close to everything. By the time Mom arrived, the house was a bit of a mess, but I was ready to go and I managed to telekinetically move a fair amount of the strewn about objects back to their original places. The fact that I was done and the place wasn't a complete mess was what really mattered. I've already looked around the dojo personally and I think it'll be perfect for you, Izuku. I could see her eyes going glassy, only just holding back tears of joy, and I was almost unaware of the grin that slipped onto my face. We got out onto the road, briskly walking to meet the 7:30 start and playing hero trivia games along the way. In no time at all, we'd reached our destination and Mom was seeing me off. Bye Izu, have an amazing time and tell me all about it when you get back. Mom's voice wobbled as she wiped a few tears from her eyes, but she smiled happily. Izuku, my baby, I'm so proud of you, you've been so strong. Thank you, Mom, I replied. Thank you for believing in me and being proud of me. I will get stronger, I vowed as I walked away from her into the light of the dojo. Third-person POV. Inko watched as her son retreated into the building. To say she was shocked would be an understatement, but the emotion she felt even more than that, confusion. Inko was so confused as to how her son had supposedly replied to her thoughts. She was sure she hadn't said how proud she was aloud. Maybe she was just tired and had actually said it. She had stayed up late and woken up early after all. A resigned Inko sighed as she turned around, trudging in the direction of the office. She could worry about all of this later. Izuku stood awestruck in the middle of a large, sleek training room, a gaggle of kids his age surrounding him. Many of them were socializing with each other and Izuku had half a mind to join them, but he thought better of it after considering how awkward it would be. A few minutes after the last kid had entered the room, a lady with a broad build walked in. Her black hair was tied up into a high ponytail and training wraps encased her arms. She looked intimidating. Welcome to my dojo, you punks. My name's Sakura, she exclaimed, flashing them all a wide grin. In the first half of today's lesson, I want to focus on teaching you all a few basic moves in hand-to-hand combat as well as start you all on strength training. In the second half, well, I think we'll do some quirk training and at the very end some sparring. Izuku found himself getting excited over the whole idea. He'd get to learn MMA and learn to control and strengthen his quirk. Sakura led them all to the front of the training room and began teaching them some simple but useful moves. Roundhouse kicks, jabs, uppercuts, they were doing it all, and it was exhilarating. Izuku felt like he was really living when he was practicing those movements. Before long, the physical portion of the training had come to an end and quirk practice began. Izuku focused a majority of his time on trying to move about heavier objects. He'd successfully managed to learn the basics of his quirk. Inko had even called him a natural. Izuku could easily manipulate small to medium-sized objects. He could even move people using his quirk. He'd found that out accidentally when he just started learning. He'd been trying to grab a bowl but accidentally pulled his mom towards him instead. He could also lift larger objects, but he hadn't really had many heavy things to practice on at home and he hadn't found a limit. Izuku was lifting up different sized weights using his telekinesis, a feat he was finding easy until he finally reached the last weight, 1,000 kilograms. The other kids had all already stopped their quirk training in favor of watching him lift weights that were heavier than all of them put together, but this weight caught even Sakura's attention. Even with her strength enhancement quirk and years of experience under her belt, she still struggled with that weight often, although she could lift it if she pushed herself. She watched as the 10-year-old boy picked up the menace using his quirk, slowly at first but speeding up as he built up his confidence and began flexing it up and down, 10 times before he gently released it onto the bar which it belonged on. The room was silent for a second. Everyone stood shocked before an eruption of sound occurred. All the kids were shrieking, whooping, cheering, and talking about how awesome the green-haired kid was. Usually, Sakura would have been quick to shut them down, but even she couldn't help feeling extremely impressed with the show she'd just witnessed. Izuku just stood in the middle of it all, a heavy blush dusting his cheeks as he hid behind his hands embarrassed. He was shocked that his training had gathered so many people and even more surprised that they'd actually been impressed. Sakura decided she'd had enough of the kids yelling and pushed through them towards Midoriya, who they were all facing. "That was really impressive, kid. Even I struggle with that weight sometimes," she said, nodding to him. She turned back towards the other students. "All right, boys and girls, now I think we're going to start on the promise sparring." The children started murmuring amongst themselves, getting pumped up and ready to display their abilities. "But I feel like spicing things up today. You'll all be participating in a round-robin sparring tournament. Winner gets a surprise." She smirked as all the children once again started getting excitable. She would use this tournament as a way to gauge how strong their quirks were and how they could improve. "Everyone draw a stick." There were 16 sticks, 2 sets all numbered from 1 to 8. There were 16 kids, so using that logic, Izuku deduced he'd be up against whoever drew the same number as him. He picked a 2. Izuku looked around to see a lilac-haired boy wielding a lollipop stick labeled 2 like a sword. He looked at the boy wondering what his quirk was, but put that matter aside. Izuku drew out his analysis notebook and pen as he watched the first match unfold. A black-haired girl called Akari was fighting a silver-haired boy called Jin. The match started with Jin instantly raising up a bunch of silver pillars from the ground in an attempt to trap Akari, but before they could get anywhere near her, she flicked her hand and an inferno of fire raged forward, destroying the pillars and forcing Jin back until he had stepped out of the ring. Akari Hataru defeats Jin Seo to win the match and proceed to the next round. All the while, Izuku was furiously scribbling in his book, taking notes on his classmates about their quirks and how to beat them. He acknowledged that Akari had a powerful fire quirk which he hadn't seen the limit of, and Jin's silver quirk wasn't heat-resistant. "Midoriya, Tiha is waiting for you." Izuku abruptly snapped out of his analysis mode only to see the lilac-haired boy from earlier already in the ring looking at him expectantly. "Oh, sorry." He laughed awkwardly as he stepped into the ring. The lilac-haired boy, Tiha, looked him up and down, grinning before sitting down the moment the match started and patting the floor. Izuku was confused for a second before the ground in the ring shook, almost throwing him off. Balance and large spikes of earth started rising, pushing him back towards the edge. Izuku was on the verge of panicking and losing when he felt the urge to close his eyes. When he closed his eyes, he instantly felt another eye, one he was unaware of, opening up. He could see Tiha still tapping the ground with his fingertips despite his actual eyes being shut. He directed his thoughts at the boy before a spike of earth could swing him out of bounds and proceeded to telekinetically fling the other boy out of the ring, subsequently winning the match and shocking everyone watching. Izuku Midoriya defeats Tsupeika Tiha to proceed to the next round, Sakura shouted as the two boys bowed to each other and left the ring. Izuku brought out his notebook again the minute he was out and watched the set of matches, intently analyzing absolutely everything he saw. The match after his was between a boy with a scythe quirk and a spider quirk user. It started off pretty close, but when the spider girl started using her webs, her opponent simply chopped them down before using hand-to-hand and pinning her down for 10 seconds. Masayoshi Kumayami defeats Arachnia Nakamura to proceed to the next round, Sakura boomed. The next match was between a boy with a wind quirk and a blonde-haired girl with a sand quirk. The match was unsatisfyingly quick. The second both competitors had entered the ring, a strong gust of wind blew the blonde back out. Inasa Yorashi defeats Suna Hirohito to proceed to the next round. The match following that one was between a shapeshifter named Mai and a weather manipulator named Sora. The match was something of a cat-and-mouse game. The second it began, Mai shrunk down, becoming an ant, and began running around to avoid the lightning bolts that Sora was sending down. Once she'd reached Sora, she'd transformed into a python and had grabbed onto the weather manipulator, who panicked and struck them both with a lightning bolt. Mai passed out, Sora did not. Sora Tenki defeats Mai Henko to proceed to the next round. The match after was odd. Hana Kiyama had rolled back her sleeve and let a potent sleeping gas into the air. Supposedly her opponent Seiichi Hantakaun should have been down in seconds. Instead, the The boy had slipped and fallen onto the ground where the gas wasn't really taking effect. The fall had been at an awkward angle and somehow, he'd taken Kiyama down with him. They were a dazed heap on the floor, but when 10 seconds had passed, Sakura acknowledged Seiichi was on top. Seiichi Hantakouan defeats Hana Kiyama to proceed to the next round. Everyone was confused. Had Seiichi even used his quirk? Izuku was literally dying with happiness over the newfound quirks and how all of his classmates fought. He couldn't wait for the opportunity to get to fight them himself. The match following that odd ordeal was between Maki and Sayuri. When Maki activated her quirk, many in the room gasped. 6 black tentacles escaped from her back. Her skin turned from pale to completely white and her red eyes completely vanished. Sayuri on the other hand stopped, looking at her hand, and when she saw light there, she decided to give something a go. Sayuri charged towards Maki, the bright light glowing in her hand burning brighter as she stuffed it towards the other girl, who shrieked, shrinking back and then eventually passing out. Sayuri Urahara defeats Maki Akamai to proceed to the next round. The final match of the first round was between a boy named Kai Yamoto and a girl named Aoi Watanabe. It seemed like it was going to be difficult for either of them to win until Kai put on a pair of blue headphones and started dancing. It wasn't exactly dancing, but it was similar, Izuku noted. Every so often he'd unplug his headphones from the player they were on and direct the sound at Aoi. The music was so loud that everyone cringed away whenever he did it, and Aoi was on the floor grabbing her ears, which looked like they were bleeding. How is this dude not deaf? Everyone thought in unison. Everyone was fairly certain that Kai had won when quite literally out of the blue, Aoi showed up out of a different part of the floor. Although she was struggling, she moved her hands and the blue parts of the mat started swaying. She then proceeded to whip her arm out and the headphones were ripped right from Kai's ears into her hand. The second they weren't on his person, he looked like he was going to have a panic attack. "I yield, give me back my headphones, damn it!" he shouted angrily, and she threw them back to him, satisfied at her win. Aoi Watanabe defeats Kai Yamoto to proceed to the next round. Sakura beamed down at all of them. "Your skills and fighting spirit are amazing, all of you. Congratulations to those of you in the next round, and those of you who lost. I'm very impressed by what I've seen so far. Keep it up." And with that little speech in their heads, those of them who'd won once again selected sticks, from 1 to 4 this time. 4. Izuku looked around only to see Kumayami glaring at him. That answered the question of who he'd be up against. The lineup was Inasa Yurashi v Aoi Watanabe, Kari Hataru v Sayuri Urahara, Sora Tenki v Seiichi Hantakouan, Izuku Midoriya v Masayoshi Kumayami. His match was last, and yet whenever he looked over at Kumayami's glowering expression, he couldn't help but feel anxious. Izuku wasn't really paying attention to the matches, but he was still keeping track of who was winning. In the first match, Watanabe had tried to manipulate the blue in the area but had simply been blown away by Yurashi. In the second match, Sayuri had opened her hands to reveal water powers. She tried to deal with Akari accordingly, but the flames were just too much. The water was evaporated and Sayuri was forced out of the ring. The third match had been short and decisive. Essentially anything and everything that could go wrong for Seiichi went wrong, and he was struck by lightning as well as burnt by the sun in his match with Sora. Before he passed out, Izuku heard him mumbling something about stupid luck powers. He was too nervous for his own match to contemplate it any further though. Finally, he walked into the ring and faced Kumayami. The other boy was still glaring at him as the match started, and he summoned his scythe. They ran at each other. Izuku tried to use his telekinesis on the boy, but he was too fast for him to be able to catch him out. Izuku cursed his inexperience. There were times he managed to rip the scythe from the user, but somehow he could always summon it back. Before long, Kumayami started saying his every move out loud before he did them, letting Izuku dodge them. This was confusing for Izuku, who had no idea why the other boy would be talking through his moves, for Kumayami, who had no clue how Izuku was dodging his strikes before he'd even lifted his scythe, and for the class who were simply watching the silent death dance in anticipation. Kumayami finally managed to get some better footing. He didn't even think about what he did next, and he managed to strike his opponent. It was to his extreme shock when his scythe went through Izuku instead of striking him. Everyone gasped and Kumayami stood confused. He whipped his weapon at the boy again, and sure enough it just went through him, not leaving a scratch. Izuku was confused beyond relief, but he found his feet quickly and used his opponent's momentary distraction to his advantage. 1 second Kumayami was in the ring gaping, the next he was outside of it, a green aura encasing him, and gently dropping him to the ground. Izuku Midoriya defeats Masayoshi Kumayami to proceed to the semi-finals. Again, some amazing work from all of ya punks. I've picked the matches myself for the semis to give you all a bit more of a challenge. In the first match, Izuku Midoriya will be up against Akari Hataru, and in the second match, we'll have Sora Tenki up against Inesa Yorashi. Izuku again felt his anxiety rising at the concept of having to go head-to-head with the class-resident pyromaniac, but he shoved down the fear and walked into the ring. Akari, his opponent, gave him a once-over before the match began. "Hey, do you yield?" She mocked him. "And no of course," he shouted back. Her face darkened and she smiled at him, obviously annoyed. "MMK, then perish?" A river of flames began snaking towards him. Izuku should have been afraid, he should have been forced back like everyone else before him, and yet he felt comfort in the fire. As the first flame was about to burn him, it stopped. Then all the flames stopped. Akari could only watch in dismay as her usual red flames became an emerald green, and rather than rushing her opponent out, they rushed towards her. It took her a minute of dodging before the entire ring was consumed, Izuku in the middle of it all. Normally Akari would have been fine under such circumstances, but the green fire was completely different to any other kind. It actually hurt her. Akari was forced out of the ring. Izuku Midoriya defeats Akari Hataru to proceed to the finals. As he walked out of and away from the ring, Izuku felt a spike of heat behind him and turned to see Akari face to face with him. He instantly prepared himself to be yelled at. She seemed hot-headed. "I thought you were a telekinetic, not a pyromancer." The dark-haired girl raged. I don't actually know what happened?" Another voice joined in the conversation. "Not to mention how you dodged me as if you knew exactly what I was going to do in advance." He spun around to see the figure of Kumayami leaning on a wall staring at them both. "But you were saying it all out loud before you did it?" "No, I wasn't. And how come my scythe didn't affect you? Normally it paralyzes the living?" That comment weirded Izuku out slightly, but he focused on the questions. "Look guys, I don't know how any of this is happening. I haven't even gone to the Quirk doctors to register my quirk yet. It's very new to me." The other two were shocked at that news. Midoriya used his quirk with what seemed to be a practiced ease. Every time they'd seen it, from watching his weight training to all of his matches, he'd seemed perfectly in sync with it, in control. It couldn't be new. Akari humphed, "This conversation isn't over, Midoriya," as she stalked off. "Agreed." Kumayami nodded curtly and walked away to watch the remainder of Yorashi and Tenki's match. Izuku didn't go back. He just pondered over the questions they'd asked him and the new knowledge he'd gained. Supposedly he could manipulate fire, and he wasn't completely sure, but maybe read people's minds? That would explain him hearing what Kumayami had been planning to do while everyone else heard silence. He had no idea what had happened with the scythe though. He'd have to figure that out later. He was interrupted from his thoughts by Sakura's boom. Inesa Yorashi defeats Sora Tenki to proceed to the finals. Izuku was actually pretty shocked by that outcome. He'd expected Sora to win due to her weather manipulation being up against a wind quirk. When he actually asked though, someone explained to him what he'd missed. Tenki has a powerful quirk and it should have definitely been a matchup in her favor, but it seems like those other matches took a lot out of her. She was able to put up a good fight and negate Yorashi's win for a while, but eventually she collapsed from what Sakura believes to be quirk exhaustion. Sakura just took her to the health and rest room. Poor Tenki, hopefully she's okay, Izuku thought, worried. "Okay you punks, it's time for the long-awaited finals." Sakura had returned, and with her declaration came a loud cheer from many of the children. The final match is between Inesa Yorashi and Izuku Midoriya. "Both of you take your places please." Izuku walked into the ring and looked at his opponent. He knew the second the match started, he needed to move extremely quickly or hold himself in place telekinetically to avoid being blown out of the ring immediately. The match started and Izuku opted for the second option, managing to stand his ground with his quirk until the initial gust was over. He felt a great determination burning inside of him. He'd gotten this far, he wasn't going to lose now. He looked over to see Urashi racing towards him on what seemed to be a tornado, and he began to run. The winds being emitted from the mini tornado were powerful enough to start sucking him in when he tried to escape to a free part of the ring. Izuku was desperately trying to free himself from the grasp of the winds when he again felt the fire of determination inside of him burning brighter. It was then that Izuku decided then he'd try something new. He shut his eyes again, willing his third eye to open like it had earlier, and when it did, he could see the tornado as well as the boy on top of it. The tornado was different though. He could see white lines along it, cracks. He started pulling at them telekinetically, and he watched as with each line he pulled away, the tornado crumbled more and more. The others watched as Urashi seemingly lost control of his quirk and fell to the ground. His tornado shattered. They watched as he began to float in a green aura and futilely tried to blow himself away from the edge of the ring with his quirk. They watched as he gently fluttered to the ground outside of the ring, as if caught in the gentlest of breezes. Izuku Midoriya defeats Inasa Urashi to win the tournament. Sakura exclaimed. Urashi looked back at Midoriya, who was smiling happily in the ring. He knew the second the match had begun he needed to speak to the other boy. In him he saw such passion. All of the children were shrieking their approval and applauding for their champion when Sakura cleared her throat. It seems you all forgot I offered the winner a surprise. She jumped over the barrier, landing in the ring with a loud thump. Izuku instantly felt an intense feeling of dread drowning out his previously celebratory mood. The winner's surprise, she tightened her hand wraps, is facing me in a match. The children's shrieks of joy very quickly became shrieks of fear for the green-haired boy. Izuku himself was terrified, but he steeled his nerves, nodding towards his teacher. Urashi, as the runner-up, I'm leaving you in charge of starting the match. Inasa was delighted to hear that. He couldn't wait to see such a show of passion. Yes, ma'am. He bowed so low his head hit the ground. Whenever you're ready. Sakura smirked, activating her quirk. She wasn't going to hold back, and she hoped the kid knew it. She needed to at least get a taste of his full potential. You may begin. Inasa shouted, and the second he did, the ring was an explosion of speed. Midoriya was running as fast as his legs would carry him to evade the strikes that his mentor was constantly sending at him. The match was quickly becoming a game of cat and mouse when Midoriya suddenly stopped, looked at his opponent, and started dodging her strikes with a calm ease. What kind of strange darkness is this? That's exactly what he was doing in our match. Kamiyami murmured to the other students, who all gave him an odd look before nodding in agreement. Sakura was on the verge of striking the boy when he stepped out of the way, under, over, to the side with every attempted hit, as if predicting her every move. She was finding it frustrating but exhilarating. She hadn't expected him to last anywhere near this long. She decided she would truly stop holding back and let herself go on autopilot, following her heart instead of her brain. Izuku seemed to start struggling after that, and she was about to grab him when a wall of green flames erupted in front of her, forcing her to jump back. The flames started to move closer and closer to Sakura, forming a ring and backing her up against the side of the ring. That's what the broccoli boy did to me. Akari screamed at the rest of the audience, who couldn't help but chuckle slightly at her obvious annoyance. Sakura had almost lost. Losing wasn't something she'd often experienced, and so instead of letting herself be defeated, she did the next best thing. Sakura took a leap of faith through the fire. She felt the flames licking at her skin, burning her, but the sensation only lasted a second as she passed through them, fist already formed. Her quirk was activated and she rocketed towards the boy at an incredible speed. Izuku felt his teacher coming at him, but she was coming so fast he knew he had no time to move. Her fist was glowing slightly. Quirk active, punch will hurt a lot. His brain told him. Izuku did not feel like getting hurt a lot. He was praying that something would happen, anything to get him out of that sticky situation, and when he closed his eyes in expectation of the impact, he certainly didn't expect for his prayers to be answered. Everyone in the room gasped, looking around, trying to find the green-haired boy. They'd expected him to be knocked out by their teacher, but he'd simply vanished before she'd been able to hit him, a green fire burning where he'd been stood seconds earlier. Sakura and the children looked around only to see Izuku stood out of bounds on the opposite side of the room to where he was earlier, looking shocked. Izuku Midoriya is out of bounds, so Sakura wins. Yurashi shouted. This kid. Sakura couldn't help but think as she walked up to Midoriya and congratulated him. His skill and technique were amazing. We'll have to work on speed and physical strength, but that's the closest to a win anyone's had against me in years. Thank you, Sakura. I'll work hard to improve on my speed and strength, and maybe one day I'll beat you. Midoriya beamed, determination shining through his face. Heh, I'll be looking forward to it, kid, she smirked. Wait, I didn't say that aloud, did I? If I didn't and he read my mind, that would explain the easy dodges. She sighed. Alright everyone, that's it for today. I've been absolutely amazed by all of your hard work and spirit. I hope to see more of it. Your parents should be in the office? She bowed. It's been a pleasure teaching you all today. Until next time. The children all bowed back and went to grab their bags. Midoriya was about to grab his bag and leave the building when his path was intercepted by the tall boy he'd fought in the finals, Inasa Yurashi, if he remembered correctly. Hello Midoriya. I wanted to thank you for our fight. It was amazing and you fought with such passion. It was inspiring. I would also like to ask, would you, Midoriya, be willing to become friends with me? He bowed so low his head clanged against the ground rather comically, and Izuku couldn't help but laugh a bit at the display. Thank you. Midoriya stammered, fighting UW is an H honor and I would love to be your friend Yurashi. Yurashi grinned, call me Inasa, we're friends after all. Then you have to see call me Izuku. The pair walked out of the dojo together laughing, and Izuku couldn't help but feel content about the idea of having a friend again. Over the week he was suspended, and even after that, Izuku attended the dojo every day, more often than any of his peers. He found himself becoming addicted to the rush that training gave him and being the one to question the techniques that Sakura gave them. His fiery determination and commitment to learning was what gained him approval in his mentor's eyes, and he quickly became a star pupil, although this could be considered a somewhat negative thing as he'd also become Sakura's favorite person to practice demonstrations on. He could still feel the bruise where Sakura had axe-kicked him the day before. He'd continued to practice training and exercising and had even started making some headway with the fire aspect of his quirk. Inko had acknowledged how him having it made sense as his Sashi could breathe fire. Over the course of his time there, he'd also made another friend. Although he'd come off as cold in the beginning, Masayoshi Kumayami had been willing to befriend him once he realized how dedicated to becoming stronger he was. He and Inasa had quickly leveled up to what Izuku would call his best friends in just the first week. Overall, Izuku could easily say the dojo was one of the best things that had happened to him. One day of suspension to go. Izuku was exhausted in every sense of the word. He'd been putting his heart and soul into training, so when he finally had the opportunity to take a true rest, he grabbed at the chance like his life depended on it. He was prepared, or at least he felt prepared for school tomorrow. He was even ready to face Kaken again. Obviously he had some regrets, maybe a lot of regrets, but he knew he'd be able to work to make things right and give his classmates a proper apology. For now, the best he could do was get himself some rest. Inko had watched fondly as her son stumbled up the stairs to his room at 6 p.m. in preparation for his return to school the next day. She had no doubt in her mind that he'd feel guilty for his actions, but she knew he was strong. She knew he could work through his feelings and do the right thing. Good night, Izuku, sleep well? Inko called after him. Good night, Mom. Izuku replied sluggishly. He walked into his bedroom and immediately fell onto his bed. It took him mere seconds to go out like a light. Inko's POV. 1 a.m., suspension over. I was on my way to check on Izuku for the night when a scream pierced the air, cutting through the late-night silence. I began running, praying for my son's safety. Hopefully a villain hadn't attacked. What if Favelin hate attacked and he'd be in kidnap Peter worse, and dit twazel my fault for being gay terriblemether to him. Mumbling, stop mumbling, Inko. I angrily whispered to myself as I yanked open the door to Izuku's room. Please be alright, please be alright, please be alright, oh my god. Izuku was screaming and panting as if he'd run a marathon, trying his best to gulp in air. A cold sweat was making its way down his brow. The thing that struck me though, that had first drawn my attention was the fact that my son was floating. Not too high, levitating just above his bed, and yet, he twisted and turned as if he was still in it. Definitely a nightmare. Izuku dear, wake up? I called out. Normally I would have shaken him awake, but I didn't know what would happen if I touched him, so I kept my distance. He screamed again, a sound full of pain and anguish, and I felt my heart drop. Izuku, I wanted to do something, and yet I felt so powerless, so useless. I couldn't even help my own child when he needed it most. I bowed my head and I could feel hot tears rolling down my face. What kind of mother can't help her son? Izuku, I just want to support you, and yet I can't. I don't even truly know what's wrong. I'm so sorry. He turned again, mouth opening in a silent cry before a white mist began forming around him, eventually filling the room. I blinked, and where the mist had been a split second earlier, there was what appeared to be a classroom. Upon closer inspection, I realized I recognized the room. I'd been in that exact room for so many parents' evenings before. It was his classroom. I watched as children appeared at the empty desks and a teacher stood at the front teaching them basic English grammar. The door slammed open and everybody in the room froze. Turning to the source of the sound, I saw it was none other than Izuku, who'd struck such fear into those in the room. He stood at the door talking bitterly and laughing at the hardships he'd been forced through. I think it's about time that I took my turn, don't you think? If my stomach could have dropped any further than it already had, at that moment it did. Izuku's lips were turned up in a feral smile and he crossed the room in a flash, slamming another child into a wall and leaving him passed out, bleeding as he turned his attention to the others. Izuku, baby, no? This isn't right, stop. My words fell upon deaf ears. I watched as he took down more and more of his classmates, each one falling faster than the one before. It shocked me that they were all using their quirks and he was still pummeling through them as if they were nothing. A short exchange of blows, another injured and unconscious child, then on to the next one. A cycle which didn't seem to be ending. Until only 2 other people were standing. I watched as he turned his gaze onto his teacher, who seemed to be backing away slowly towards the door. Was he really just going to leave his students there, despite the fact they needed help? Pathetic. I watched as my son flicked his fingers and the door slammed shut. So even during the whole fiasco, he was using his quirk. No one was aware of it though. He actually made quick work of his teacher, although he seemed to go the extra mile with his attack on him and messed up his face fairly badly. I'm probably a terrible person for thinking this, but he kind of deserved that. I give you all permission to use your quirks. He shouted as he fell to the ground unconscious. He would have only let them start defending themselves with their quirks this late? They were already using them and he's talking as if all his students aren't unconscious around him. The literal only person standing is Katsuki. That's so foolish. The more I saw of Izuku's teacher, the more I felt my contempt for him rising, and I could only feel relief when I remembered he'd been dismissed from his post as a result of this very incident as well as events prior to it. Katsuki almost blew him as well as the rest of the room up, and now speaking to Mitsuki has leveled up substantially on my list of priorities. I watched the exchange of words and blows between Katsuki and Izuku. I watched as my son vented out all of his anger on the other boy, the venomous words on his tongue accompanied by deadly strikes. I watched as the blonde boy was overpowered, arms broken and beaten to a pulp. Even though he'd been terrible to Izuku, I still felt a mild guilt as he passed out. Izuku stood up looking around himself and suddenly started giggling. I felt my blood freeze, horrified. In seconds the little giggling fits had become full-blown maniacal laughter. It sounded hysteric to me though, desperate. All the objects in the room began to zoom chaotically through the air until finally, I am here, sorry to be Elidash. The two seemed to make eye contact before Izuku promptly shrieked and collapsed. It was then that the image deteriorated, leaving nothing but an empty space where it had been. Suddenly, another shrill scream cut through the air, followed by another and another. I looked back at Izuku in alarm, only to see a wide range of glowing objects spinning around him. He was thrashing about in midair, seemingly trying to free himself from the nightmare of his own creation. I reached my hand out to see if I could actually touch the objects, and sure enough, they were solid. Different from the objects in the memory? Dream? Vision? Then, everything just passed through me, but now it's obvious that won't happen. He's probably moving them using his telekinesis? I deduced. Izuku started mumbling then, quietly at first before getting louder and louder. The mumbling developed into sobs and from sobs into hysterical apologies. He was apologizing to nothing at all, and yet he was begging for forgiveness, for acceptance. It was heart-wrenching to watch. It was at that moment that I strengthened my resolve. He came first. If I got injured in attempt to help him, so be it. I rushed into the epicenter of the chaos where Izuku was levitating and furiously tried to wake him up, dodging as random pieces of furniture zoomed left and right. A few seconds felt like an age, but when he finally woke, I couldn't even describe the immense sense of relief that washed over me. All of the objects suddenly vanished and he abruptly fell to the floor, where he stayed, curling in on himself and trembling. I was quick to approach him and wrap him in a hug, speaking gentle reassurances until eventually he seemed to relax. Once enough time had passed, I helped him to his feet and lead him down to the living room, leaving him on the sofa as I rushed into the kitchen to retrieve some milk and a packet of cookies. If Izuku wasn't able to go to sleep again that night, and Inko had stayed up to watch hero shows and eat cookies with him until the next morning, neither of them mentioned it later. Inko had turned off the movies around 5 o'clock in the morning when Izuku had begun getting ready for school. She wanted him to get to his classes on time after all. The minute he'd gone upstairs, she dragged out her phone and made 2 calls, one to her friend and one to the doctor. Both were brief, but she was happy with the results of them. Inko prepared pancakes for breakfast. She'd been trying her hand at American recipes and Izuku seemed to like them, and a bowl of katsudon as a treat for his lunch. When Izuku came down the stairs at 5:35, he looked pristine but drained. Inko sighed. There was little she could do about that. "Izuku, your breakfast and lunch are already on the table?" she called. "Thanks, Mom, I think I'm going to head out in a minute," he replied. "All right, tell me if anything happens at school today. Love you," she said, and he walked towards the door. "Oh." He turned to look back at her. "Remember to come straight back after school. We're seeing the Quirk doctors today." He was confused for a second. His appointment wasn't due for another week, until he realized how after last night, his mother had probably made some last-minute arrangements. "Oh, okay, will do, thank you," he babbled, red in the face as he ran out of the house. Inko stood stunned for a second and then burst into laughter. She only laughed harder when she noticed that Izuku's keys, which he'd left on the table, were glowing green and zooming out of the living room window, which she'd left slightly ajar. "I'm sure he'll be fine today," she thought as the last of her giggles subsided. "He's strong, he can do it." Izuku had arrived at school early for once and taken his seat, watching as his classmates poured in before the morning bell. Usually, they would taunt him or even start beating him up if he was early, one of the reasons why he always made sure to be late, but today, they all just kept their distance. When Bakugo walked in, he didn't even look in Izuku's direction. Instead, storming straight to his seat and staring at the front until the teacher came in. That was really odd, but Izuku wasn't complaining. After a while, the teacher walked in, someone completely different from his previous teacher, and he couldn't help the relief that washed over him. She greeted both him and Bakugo as they were yet to meet her and then started the lesson. Throughout the day, Izuku began picking up on the thoughts of his peers. "Isn't it dangerous to have him here? I thought he was expelled. He's so scary." He sighed at the hypocrisy of the majority of them. All of the students in the room had physically hurt him at some point or another in their time at the school. When he walked through the halls, he didn't hear insults being shouted at him. Instead, he heard whispers. The rumors, little quips, and fear running rampant in the school body. It didn't take him that long to figure out that he wasn't going to be bothered. The other students were all avoiding him like the plague, which in all honesty, he didn't mind too much. It was somewhat refreshing to know that he wasn't going to be attacked or bullied at every turn. The only student that was acting somewhat oddly was Bakugo. Izuku had noticed how whenever the blonde thought he wasn't looking, he seemed to take glances at him. He'd only made eye contact with the other boy once during one such event, and the look he'd seen was extremely cryptic, resembling a look of deep thought. The strange glances weren't occurring just once or twice, though. Bakugo's mysterious looks were happening throughout the entirety of the morning. Izuku told himself he was going to ask the other boy at lunch. It was just too weird. At lunch, he sat alone on the roof eating his bento box of katsudon. The atmosphere was serene and the weather was nice, so he was perfectly happy eating there. After a while, heavy footsteps started making their way towards him and he swiftly turned, only to see none other than Katsuki Bakugo standing behind him. The blonde-haired boy soon sat down next to Izuku and shifted about a bit, making himself comfortable. A heavy silence hung in the air between the two as they sat side by side looking down on the rest of the school and the endless stretch of land beyond. Both seemed to want to say something but neither wanted to start until... "The view up here is amazing." Bakugo broke the silence, still looking at the horizon and refusing to face the greenette. "Why yeah, it's pretty cool," Izuku replied. They stayed like that for a couple of minutes before Bakugo finally sighed and turned to face Izuku. "Look, I didn't come up here for no reason. I came to apologize for being a douche to you for so long. I was acting like an idiot and I've actually got to admit it," he grumbled. Izuku just gaped, jaw dropped at his ex-friend. I must be dreaming. Is this a J-joke? Am I hallucinating? Why you must be an imposter? Where's the real Kaken? Shut up, nerd. You're not dreaming. It's me, you idiot. Ivy apologized and I'm never going to do it again. Izuku was almost in tears. Kaken, would sorry? Katsuki took a deep breath. Because over my suspension, I've had the chance to think about a few things and I think that I might have been wrong. Because you're strong, you beat the teacher, hell, you even beat me when I was using my quirk. You never were a Deku, were you? Hearing that thought, Izuku instantly knew what his answer to the apology would be. The tears which had been making his eyes glassy finally began spilling over. "Kaken, I accept your apology," he said with conviction. The blonde sighed. "Well, thank the Lord for that," he whispered quietly. "Ugh, your tears are getting everywhere. Stop it, you nerd." "I'm sorry, it's just a lot to PP process." Izuku sniffed. Fine. Also, why the hell do you look like death personified? Did you not sleep last night, you idiot?" Katsuki turned to Izuku, his eyes narrowing into a glare. You better take care of yourself, nerd, or I'll end you." Kaken. After a while, the two finally got up and headed back down to the classroom. In a house not so far away. Mitsuki's POV. Inko sat face to face with me at a coffee table and we were both laughing about a nostalgic memory, drinking tea before she finally stopped and looked me dead in the eye. "So Mitsuki, I heard that Katsuki hasn't been being very nice to Izuku?" The way she said it implied that it was a lot more than simply not being nice, and although she smiled at me sweetly, I could feel an intense death aura coming off of my friend. "What? I'll kick his ass. The little sheet has no right to be disrespectful to Izuku." I felt my anger and annoyance rising, and I punched my fist into my palm, preparing myself to go on the warpath. That brat. The aura just seemed to grow and her smile widened, become sickly sweet. Somehow, despite that, she looked annoyed. I heard small cracking sounds and I looked only to see the cup in her hands was slowly fracturing from the pressure of her squeezing it. What was that? Sweet, too sweet, way too sweet. I felt an intense cold sweat breaking out on my forehead. I'd be thankful if this was just a nightmare. Wrong words. Think, Mitsuki, say something that won't result in this woman ending your life today. Sorry, you can kick his ass? Please don't kill me, I didn't want to die today. No, I'm just not sure what went wrong. I'm disappointed that the boys don't get on like we do and that Katsuki thinks it's okay to harm Izuku. The death aura, it just dissipated, thank the Lord. Yeah, it's a sham. Wait, what? Oh, Katsuki was beating up Izuku every evening after school using his quirk? What the actual F dash? The brat was using explosions on Izuku? I screeched. That's so effing dangerous. I'll end the little sheet, I raged. Mitsuki, stop. Although what Katsuki was doing is unacceptable, it's considerably worse to end a child. She looked at me and laughed, shaking her head. I do expect you to react accordingly now that you're aware, though. I nodded. Of course I will, Inko. With that assurance, she stood up from her seat preparing to leave. Thank you for your time, Mitsuki, she said as she hugged me and headed out. Once she'd left, The largest sigh of relief I've ever held left my lips. I returned to the kitchen and simply watched as a few more china shards fell from the remains of Inko's cup, thankful in every sense of the word that it had been the only casualty after that conversation. Katsuki, you brat, get your goddamn sheet together. If Izuku ends up anything like his mother, you do not want to F with that. Back at the school. Bakugo's POV. The end of the day was drawing near and Izuku and I were talking. We obviously weren't best friends again, but we were testing the waters, and I think we were slowly coming to accommodate one another. At the end of the day, instead of going off with my friends, I waited behind for the nerd, and when he finally walked out of the classroom, I asked him a question. Hey, do you want to walk home together? It shouldn't have been too much to ask, but I could feel the anticipation rising as I waited for an answer. It would be better for me than going down with the extras and we go in the same direction anyway. Another thought popped into my head. Oh, you could come round mine as well if you want? Izuku gave me a very odd look at that. What's that look for? It's not my fault the hag's been wondering where the hell you've been for the past couple of years. The nerd chuckled. I would love to walk home with you, but I can't today. I need to get out of here and get home the fastest way I can so I'm not late to see the Quirk doctors. Wait, what I What the hell do you have a quirk? I didn't even realize my slip-up, I was so caught up. Well yeah, he responded coolly, I wouldn't be going to a quirk doctor if I didn't have one, would I now? I spluttered and he laughed as I took in the new information. Show me now, you damn nerd. He sighed, looked at his bag, and I watched in awe as it started to float, a green aura encasing it. That's pretty cool, obviously not as cool as mine, but pretty cool. Can you do it without looking? He turned his back to me to pick up his bag, seemingly ignoring my question before I suddenly felt the odd sensation of being lifted. I looked at myself and sure enough there was that same green aura around me. Does that answer your question, Kaken? He replied, grinning as he turned back to face me and gently released me onto the ground. That's actually pretty impressive. Also, Izuku, you may want to look at the time. He looked at the clock that hung on the wall and instantly flew into something of a panic. 5 minutes to be home, 10 before the Quirk doctors. Q Midoriya malfunctioning noises, by Kaken, see you tomorrow. By Izuku. I cackled. I couldn't help but laugh at the mess he was in. Then I watched, expecting him to run out the door at a hilariously funny speed. Instead he proceeded to completely vanish to who knows where. Izuku, what the heck? I looked on in disbelief. After completely regaining my composure, I began the trek home. Trying to gather my thoughts, they were an absolute mess. Two seemed to be recurring though. I'm glad we might actually be friends again, and maybe Izuku was never just a waste of time. Izuku's POV. I heard Kaken laughing as I scrambled, trying to think of the best way to get out of the school. I had planned on walking back home, using the quick route through the underground pass to get there, but that would take me 15 minutes. I had 5. Suddenly I had the bright idea to use my quirk. After my sparring match with Sakura, I discovered that I could teleport. It was something that I was no good at and it was really inconsistent, but I needed to at least try and see if I had any hope of getting home on time. I closed my eyes and visualized my street, my house, and tried to get it to work, trying to draw on whatever power it was within me when I felt a sudden tug in my gut as if I was being drawn elsewhere. By Kaken! I yelled. Suddenly, the tug intensified and I shut my eyes as I felt myself falling through space. The sensation was odd but exhilarating, not something I'd ever felt before learning how to do it. When my feet hit the ground, I slowly cracked my eyes open, praying that I'd be anywhere near my planned destination. It was with great relief that I realized I was in fact on the opposite side of the right street. I quickly rushed to my house and hurried in, searching for Mom, who I found patiently waiting in the living room. Just in time, Izu, I was worried you were going to be late. Sorry to worry you, Mom. Anyway, we should probably head out so I don't miss my appointment, I stated, pointing to the clock. Yup, you're right, we've got barely any time left, she gasped as we left the house. The doctor's residence wasn't too far. It was about 2 streets from our house, and walking briskly, we were able to arrive there in about 2 minutes, giving me the opportunity to slump in a chair and zone out while Mom checked in. Izuku, the hospital has had to delay your appointment, Someone that they need here for the testing has been held up, so we may have to wait anywhere between half an hour and 2 hours, sweetheart. I almost started grumbling about having to risk teleporting for no reason when I remembered Mom wasn't aware that I'd tried it. That's fine. I just hope whoever it is arrives soon. I sighed. After that, I just shut my eyes and waited in silence. I felt completely drained due to my utter lack of sleep last night, and it didn't take long for me to doze off in the warmth of the waiting room. 1 hour and 30 minutes later. Third-person POV. Izuku Midoriya, the doctor is ready to see you, a blue-haired lady announced. The green-haired boy didn't make a single move despite his name having just been called. Inko could hear him snoring, and she knew he probably needed more sleep, but she couldn't let the appointment go to waste. Izuku, you need to wake up now. It's time for you to take your quirk test, dear. Inko murmured as she shook him awake. The younger Midoriya groaned but eventually stood up from his chair, blinking the sleep out of his eyes before he seemed to remember where they were. Are they ready yet? He asked his mom. Yup, you were just called. If Izuku hadn't been awake already, that certainly woke him up. He shot towards the door that the lady was standing at before stopping and waiting for his mother to catch up. When they both had arrived at the door, the woman addressed them. Hello, my name is Nurse Umi. Sorry for the wait, Midoriyas. Everything's been set up now and the person we needed for this particular test has arrived. That aside, please follow me so we can get started. Izuku and Inko did just that, and not half a minute later, the trio walked into a small room where a middle-aged man was waiting, seemingly preparing needles and paperwork. Mrs. Midoriya, this is Dr. Ishii. He'll be attending to your son and be the person looking over and taking the results for the test. Nurse Umi informed Inko as the man swiveled round in his chair to face them. It's nice to meet you, Mrs. Midoriya. Izuku. Please take a seat, both of you. I'm going to talk you through what the quirk test entails. Inko and Izuku both promptly sat down in the 2 chairs opposite the doctor's desk while Nurse Umi remained stood by the door, and he continued. We'll begin the whole test by taking some blood samples, and I'll submit those to the analysis team immediately afterwards, so we should get a result by the time you leave. After I take some blood, we're going to go down from here into the physical testing room. Izuku, you'll be in the actual room while Mrs. Midoriya, Nurse Umi, and I will be in a spectator's room watching you work your way through my tests and making notes on your progress. We've also arranged for someone to come in to see you, as I've got some suspicions concerning your quirk, but hopefully they'll be able to clear it up. Any questions? When both Midoriyas failed to raise any questions or concerns, Dr. Ishii passed a form over to Inko for her to sign and took out a needle from a cabinet labeled blood. He asked Izuku to stay still, which the boy did, and in a second, the needle had gone in and come out. Dr. Ishii took out a wet wipe and plaster, cleaning and covering the spot he'd injected before he left the room to hand over the blood to the other team. Upon Dr. Ishii's return, all 4 of them had left the consulting room and walked down the corridor until it widened up into a room that looked similar to a gym. Izuku had been told to stay there while the 3 adults carried on down to the next door, which was to a room connected to the gym by a strengthened glass wall. Okay, Izuku, I'd like you to show us everything that you know you can already do with your quirk before we introduce our guest. Dr. Ishii started and nodded in the boy's direction. Izuku was anxious, but he took a deep breath and began. He needed to do this anyway, and the worst thing that could possibly happen was he'd teleport himself somewhere random when showing off that ability. He smirked, deciding to try something. The 3 adults were all seated 1 second, but the next, they found themselves being lifted into the air along with their chairs, notebooks, and basically all the contents of the spectating room. Telekinesis ability, Dr. Ishii murmured as he began scribbling in his book, and a strong one at that. He complimented as Izuku gently released everything to the ground without breaking a sweat. I wonder how many things he can lift up at any given time, or if the limit of that ability relies on weight. Seeing an opportunity to show off another ability, Izuku responded to that thought. Well, Dr. Ishii, I haven't found a limit to my telekinesis yet, but I know for a fact I can lift 1,000 kilograms with ease. Izuku helpfully notified him. Telekinesis and mind-reading abilities, already looking extremely promising. Okay then, Izuku, let's try something. I want you to try to lift up everything in the test room as well as the spectating room, please. Izuku honestly had no idea if he'd be able to do it, but he was definitely going to try. He started by again lifting all of the contents of the spectating room before he moved onto the room he was in. He began with the things that he assumed would be heavier and worked his way down. From the huge obstacle course which filled the room down to a random pen somebody had left on the floor. In all of about half a minute, everything in both rooms was floating except the boy himself, and knowing he'd completed the challenge, he let himself fall back and lifted himself off of the ground. Very impressive. That obstacle course probably weighs around 8,000 kilograms, not to mention you're carrying everything else and yourself. Can you feel the weight of the things you control? Dr. Ishii inquired. No, I can't feel their actual weights, but I can tell where the objects I'm controlling are located, and I can currently control anything within about a 1,500-meter radius of me, I think. Thank you for that information. You may release everything now. Izuku tentatively brought everything back to the ground before looking at the three again. Can somebody try to use their quirk on me, please? Nurse Umi stood because she was the only spectator with an offensive quirk that he hadn't come across. Are you sure about this, Midoriya? 100%, he responded. Before he had the time to think, a blast of light came flying at his head and he instantly slid to his right, effectively dodging it. Oh, sorry, reflexes, he laughed nervously. Would you mind doing that again? Nurse Umi raised an eyebrow amused before sending another light blast in his direction. Izuku didn't move, he didn't even flinch, and when the blast was about to hit him, it seemed to hit an invisible wall and dissipate. Dr. Ishii's eyes narrowed. Has anything similar to this happened before, Izuku? Izuku nodded. When I was sparring against a boy with a scythe quirk. His scythe, which was seemingly completely solid, simply passed through me. It's lead me to the conclusion that some quirks either don't work on me or are severely reduced in power when used against me. Power negation, and supposedly heightened or enhanced reflexes after that little display you put up? He chuckled. Anything else? Well, there's my fire. He opened his palm to reveal a small green flame, and I think I've got a fairly high level of pyrokinesis. The doctor was scribbling like there was no tomorrow. I can also teleport, he admitted. Can you show us, please, Izuku? Izuku again took a deep breath, mustering up his courage and visualized the spectating room, hoping that everything would be all right, and he ended up in the right place instead of on the opposite side of the country. He closed his eyes, feeling the tug in his gut and the sensation of falling in empty space before he opened them again to see he was indeed standing in the small spectating room by his mother. The other two adults looked at him expectantly and he teleported back out into the other room. Alrighty then. So we've got telekinesis, mind reading, supposedly enhanced reflexes, power negation, pyrokinesis, and teleportation. Jesus Christ, kid, is there anything else? The doctor exclaimed excitedly, a fascinated glint in his eye. No, I don't believe so. Izuku replied. Ah, okay then dash. Stop, Inko interjected, I know for certain there's more. She looked Izuku in the eyes. Last night while you were having your nightmare, your quirk was active. It was the main reason it took me so long to wake you up. She began. There were 3 things that you did unconsciously. The first one was levitating. It wasn't like you were lifting yourself using your telekinesis, there was no aura. You were simply floating. I also gained some insight into your nightmare due to the fact you physically created it in your room. There was a strange mist coming off of you that simply became what I assume was your nightmare. And finally, I don't really know how to describe this, you just made objects from a classroom appear. It was different to being able to see the mist because the objects were very real, although they disappeared when you woke up, Izuku. The doctor was writing page after page of speculation as he, Nurse Umi, and Izuku all listened in, completely invested in the news. So the kid can do more. Dr. Ishii almost shouted with pure delight. He sounded like a child who'd gotten an amazing birthday present. Izuku, could you try to do any of the things that your mother just said you could do? Nurse Umi asked the boy. Izuku nodded, determination written all over his face. I think I'm going to try levitating. Hopefully something will actually happen. He jittered, from nerves or from excitement no one will ever know. Izuku imagined himself above the ground, not too high just above it, and he slowly felt himself rising up and becoming more free. He stopped the thought process when he felt his feet truly stop touching the ground. He didn't want to overdo it. The adults watched in awe as the green net began rising off of the ground, then stopped, hovering just above it. He started moving around casually through the air, getting a feel for it before he returned back to the floor. Okay, so levitation is definitely a tick? Dr. Ishii beamed. Izuku decided he would try to create something physical next. He took a second deciding what he wanted to make, and then once he'd decided, he focused with all of his might on the object, willing it to become real. Suddenly he heard a plop and clang as a long scythe popped into existence and fell to the floor. It seemed to glow faintly, but it felt solid. "Could you bring the scythe in here so I could feel it, please?" the doctor asked, and Izuku was more than happy to comply. "Sure thing." He walked out of the test room and into the spectators' room, where he handed the scythe over to the all-too-eager doctor. "It's completely solid," he exclaimed, astonished by the fact the scythe was able to exist as well as the amazing craftsmanship. "I assume this is based off of your friend's scythe, right?" "Yup." Izuku smiled before snapping his fingers, and the scythe ceased to exist. "Okay, I'm going to try to create the mist you were talking about, Mom, and see if I can actually do anything." The adults all nodded, encouraging him, and he tried to visualize the mist, but nothing seemed to be happening. Inko, who seemed to be realizing his struggle, spoke up. "If it's any help at all, I think it materialized from your mouth." "Thanks, Mom," he replied and tried again, this time focusing on his breathing and continuing to will the mist to appear. Eventually, a pure white vapor started to form, more appearing with each breath he took, and he started visualizing himself getting into Yue. The adults watched delighted as something akin to an illusion started to form. Izuku stood at the gates of Yue, beaming as he levitated into the school. By his side, Inko saw Bakugo and another boy who she didn't know. From what she'd heard, though, she assumed that he was the Inasa Izuku had spoken about. The illusion began to flicker and then after a couple of seconds completely dissolved. So he supposedly got illusion manipulation as well. Holy moly, this kid. I assume there's nothing else that you're aware of, right? Izuku nodded in confirmation. All right then, without further ado, let's introduce our guest. The minute Dr. Ishii shouted, a copper-haired woman who appeared to be in her 20s walked in. Her curly hair traveled most of the way down her back, and she had striking emerald green eyes. She wore a black turtleneck jumper, ripped jeans, and combat boots. Izuku looked at the lady for a second before gasping in realization. "Why, you're a mind t the thought provoking hero." It had taken him a second to figure it out as she was in civilian attire, but he was fairly sure he was right. The smile the woman awarded him with for his troubles simply confirmed his suspicions. "Right, you are, little one," she replied telepathically. "I'm here to help you figure out a few things about your quirk. Dr. Ishii over there suspected you might have a psychic one once your mother called in this morning. And as I owed him a favor, you can guess he called upon me." She sighed. "I've got to admit, though, I would have come even if I didn't owe him anything, as honestly, I was intrigued. Psychic quirks are really rare, you know. And usually when they crop up, they're not too powerful. Every so often you get a really cool one, though. So tell me, what can you do?" "Well, I have telekinesis, pyrokinesis, teleportation, levitation, power negation, illusion manipulation, a weird thing that I can do, basically making physical objects from my mind, and I read minds." Mind hummed softly. "When you say, basically making physical objects from my mind, I think what you mean to say is psychic constructs. Also, you said you can read minds, but have you tried talking with someone telepathically?" "Oh, thank you, and yes, I've spoken to Dash." "No, you're not going to say you've spoken to me because that doesn't count. We're both psychics, and yup, I'm confirming that right now, just listening to you. Without a doubt you're a psychic. For all we know, we're both just reading each other's minds," she scolded him. "Go see if you can talk to one of them." She signaled to the three in the spectating room. Izuku sighed defeated and walked towards the other three adults who were sitting completely oblivious to the whole conversation that had just happened. Izuku tried to think like he'd been doing with mind. He was fairly sure he'd actually been speaking to her telepathically already, and she was just making him do this to be mean, but at the same time, he knew she had a point. Hey Mom, Dr. Ishii, Nurse Umi, can you all hear me?" The three people in question all looked up from their conversation to the boy who'd just spoken. Yup, why wouldn't we be able to hear you, Izu? Inko laughed. Izuku looked her straight in the eyes and carried on. Because I'm not actually speaking, Mom. Inko gasped as she realized what he was thinking. She corrected herself, was true. Oh my god, she thought, and she heard Izuku laughing although he didn't move his lips a bit. Anyway, thanks Mom, you too, he thought, nodding to all of them, just needed to prove to mine that I could do it. No problem, dear, Inko responded, and Izuku walked away, severing the telepathic link between himself and all three them. See, mind, I can do it? Yup, well done, you passed test 1. Now on to number 2. And what would that be? Izuku questioned her, already wary. I want you, she started, to try to brainwash me. She finished way too cheerfully. Izuku just stared at her, shocked for a second. How am I even supposed to do that? He screamed internally. Oi, stop screaming. It's not that hard. She mentally mumbled. You just need to choose a target and an order and have enough willpower to force them to submit to you. Essentially, it's just forcing thoughts and commands into someone's head, she explained. Starting the process is never the problem actually, the hard bit is countering the resistance a person naturally has up. It's a clash of wills and you have to push hard enough to win it. The difficulty differs from person to person. I assure you, it gets easier the more you do it though. Now come on, give it a go. Izuku looked at Mind and tried to think of something he could order her to do for when he broke through her defenses. Once he'd thought of a decent command, he began. Izuku focused his attention on the redhead and started getting in her headspace, an invasion of her mind. A few seconds later, he came against some resistance, quite a lot of resistance pulling against him, stopping him from gaining control. He wasn't going to try that hard for nothing. Izuku pulled back harder, trying to win the clash of wills that Mind had told him about. It kind of felt like a tug of war, and Izuku enjoyed the thrill of doing it. He pulled on the rope until Mind's mind was forced to let go, leaving him the victor. The second he'd won, it became apparent in the real world as well. Mind's eyes glazed over, becoming cloudy, her face normally full of emotion became expressionless, and her jaw went slack. I did it, Izuku thought proudly. Mind, buy me a packet of chocolate from the nearest vending machine. You have a minute, go, go, go. He giggled as the older psychic began speedily levitating away. 36 seconds later, yes, Izuku was timing, Mind returned with a packet of Maltesers in tow. Izuku grabbed the chocolate, positively glowing with happiness over the free snack. Oh, she said how to brainwash someone, but she never said how to unbrainwash someone, Izuku realized when he was halfway through his packet of sweets. Mind, can you wake up? He started to get a bit anxious when she didn't respond. She was still under the effects of the brainwashing. Think, Izuku, come on, how can you fix this? If you need to win a clash of wills to brainwash someone, then you probably need to give back what you took to free them, or I could just order her to wake up. I phrased it as a question last time, so of course it didn't do anything. He decided to go with the second option to see if it would actually work, as he was fairly sure the first way was a guaranteed wake-up call. Mind, wake up, Izuku commanded. Sure enough, the older psychic seemed to gain back control over her body. I assume you actually managed to pull it off, right? She asked immediately after she'd become fully conscious in the real world. Yeah, I did. Also, thanks for not telling me how to wake people up. I was genuinely worried you were going to be stuck brainwashed forever. Izuku mentally yelled. Hey, calm down, everything worked out. I mean, you figured out how to wake people up. Actually, wait a minute, how did you wake me up? I ordered you to wake up. That's not going to cut it, Mind stated sharply. After you duel, you need to give your opponent back their sword to truly free them. Right now, if you really just ordered me to wake up, I'm stuck in the suggestive state. I'm awake, but if you told me to do something, I'd still be forced to do it. If a person is in the suggestive and you give them a command, they won't even realize that you ordered them to do anything. They'd think they were doing it out of choice, so they're essentially still under the effects of the brainwashing. She explained. What duel? I beat you in a tug-of-war, Mind. Mind deadpanned. That's how you envisioned the clash of wills? That's so boring. Don't judge me, I couldn't think of anything else. She chuckled at his response. Yeah, I'm not judging. Just go and give me back the rope then. A few minutes later, Izuku had returned the rope and Mind was fully in control once again. Alright, you passed test 2, now on to test 3. You said you've got power negation, right? Izuku nodded, answering the question before she continued speaking. Well, I need you to turn it off if that's possible. Izuku gave the woman an odd look before searching within himself for his power negation ability. Once he'd found it, he messed around with it until he felt something change, as if he'd flipped a switch. I think I've done it. Thank you. For this test you have to do literally nothing. Wait, what? I'm just testing to see if you have something. Some psychics do, some psychics don't. I'm one of the people that doesn't. Anyways, here goes nothing. Izuku waited in silence for something to happen, anything at all. When after a minute nothing had happened, he turned to look at Mind, who he noticed was grinning at him. I don't think whatever you're doing is working, Mind. Nothing's happening? Exactly. I just tried to brainwash you, but instead of the usual clash of wills, I was met with a fortified wall. I also attempted to mess with you a bit and get you to shut down for a minute, but nothing happened. Without a doubt, you've got a built-in resistance to psychic abilities, little one. But if I'm resistant to psychic abilities, how can you read my thoughts and how are we speaking telepathically? Well, first things first, I can't actually read your thoughts. There's a mental block there stopping me from doing so. Also, telepathy is completely different. It's not intrusive or offensive, so your body allows it to take place. That's pretty useful, actually. Anyways, I think I've got one more test for you before you can leave. Okay then. Izuku internally shouted determinedly. He was ready to complete the test. I have no doubt in my mind you should be able to do this. Every psychic that I've ever met has been able to. Izuku waited in anticipation. I want you to blast one of those targets over there. She pointed to a target range on the obstacle course, with a psi blast. Izuku was confused to say the least. And what psi? Oh yeah, I need to explain the mechanics and such. Mind laughed. Psi is a particular kind of energy that a psychic can form in their mind and expel. Other people also have psi, but very minuscule amounts, only tiny traces of it. Nowhere near enough for it to actually do anything, so they live unaware of it. Alright, sure, thanks for clearing that up. Izuku gathered all of his thoughts and focused. He imagined a ball of pure white energy and he felt it forming within his mind. Now I just have to expel it. Izuku tried with all of his might to transfer the energy from his mind to the real world, but nothing seemed to happen. I guess I'll try again. Izuku tried and he tried and he tried, but no matter what he did, he seemed unable to expel the psi he'd gathered up. He could feel the concentration of the psi dwindling the longer he didn't expel it, so he knew even if he pulled it off, the subsequent blast would be weak. He sighed, frustrated. Mind, noticing the greenette was struggling, called out to him. Hey, I'm going to walk you through it, okay? Hopefully you should be able to do it with a tutorial. Izuku looked up at her, thankful for her interruption. Thanks, I don't really know where I'm going wrong. I can feel the psi in my mind, I'm able to gather it up and concentrate it, but I can't seem to expel it. Mind hummed, alright, I'll focus on that then. You said you've already got the psi gathered up, right? Izuku nodded. Well, hold both your hands out and I want you to put one hand on top of the other, kinda like a crocodile. Izuku did exactly as she said, following her lead. Good, now I want you to visualize the psi and imagine it getting bigger, more concentrated. As you do that, slowly lift the hand on top away from your bottom hand. Izuku listened and tried to visualize his psi expanding in size and power. He slowly lifted his hand as he did, and he was amazed to see that there was actually psi gathering between his fingers. The more he visualized and lifted his hand, the larger the psi orb seemed to grow. Well done, you've actually brought the psi into the world now. The last bit is easy, just push. Not with your hands, push it with your mind. It shouldn't be a dissimilar sensation to using your telekinesis actually. Izuku began to push it forward, determined to complete what he had started. He felt the orb beginning to shift and he swung towards the target in one swift motion before completely releasing the energy. The psi shot towards the target, building up speed before exploding upon contact with its destination, ripping through the target. Izuku stared at his handiwork in awe while Mind smiled, happy with his hard work. I did it! Izuku shouted, pride obvious on his face. Mind beamed down on him. Yes, you did, little one. She spoke to him for the first time. If I said you hadn't impressed me today, I would be lying. You've definitely exceeded my expectations. Well done, Izuku Midoriya. Izuku and Inko waited in the consultation room while Dr. Ishii, Mind and Nurse Umi collected his blood test results and discussed his quirk. When the three adults returned, they were all wearing huge smiles. Okay, Izuku, I'm going to give you a rundown of all the information we know about your quirk as of current, Dr. Ishii began. From the physical portion of the test, we've discerned that you've got telekinesis, mind-reading abilities, power negation, teleportation, pyrokinesis, levitation, the ability to create psychic constructs, illusion manipulation, telepathy, mind control, psychic resistance, and psi blasts. That in itself is a huge set of abilities that many could only dream of. However, the blood test has revealed a couple of other things to us. You've had a couple of your abilities since birth. These being a genius-level intellect, photographic memory, and empathic abilities. Some aspects of your quirk are passively active at all times, enhanced reflexes as I guessed earlier, enhanced senses, and a sixth, danger sense. We've also discerned that you've got ESP. In the near future we've discovered you should begin having visions due to unlocking precognition and retrocognition abilities. Nurse Umi looked away from the doctor and to Izuku, we'll definitely have to call you back in some time. Although the results have forewarned us of your upcoming visions, that's only because the ability has already fully started to form. The blood test has alerted us to the fact that this isn't the full scope of your abilities. There'll definitely be more popping up over the next couple of years. We're also going to get you to sit an IQ test in the near future because we need to find out just how far your intellect reaches. Mind grinned and began speaking telepathically. You definitely have potential, little one. I know for a fact you're going to be very, very powerful someday. You want to be a hero, right? Izuku nodded his head furiously fast. Well, when you get into you today, it's not a matter of if, it's when. Make sure to drop in and do an internship with me sometime. I have no doubt you're going to be an amazing hero and I expect you to go on to do great things. Izuku looked up at the other psychic, tears glittering on his eyelids. Thank you for everything, Mind. I promise I'll be a great hero. The thought-provoking hero nodded, satisfied with his answer. My name's Kurumi Soseki, she thought as she passed Izuku a slip of paper. That's my number. Your mom's been thinking of getting you a phone in the near future so she can check up on you more easily. She thought, glancing in Inko's direction. If you ever need help concerning your powers, don't hesitate to call. She ruffled his hair fondly before beginning to walk away. Thanks again, Miss Soseki. Izuku called after her. Dr. Ishii looked up from his papers at Izuku as he and Inko were getting ready to leave the building. There's one more thing that I completely forgot to do. I need you to name your quirk, Izuku. That had thrown Izuku off. I was never any good at naming things. Izuku panicked. Let's keep things simple. Think Izuku, come on. I think I've got it. My quirk. I'll name my quirk Psychic. Hey future self, readers. This is my first entry in my self-analysis notebook. Although I'm going to be using this book to store all the details of my quirk and how I could potentially fight better, I've decided I'll probably wind up using it as a diary as well. Anyway, without further ado, onto my quirk. Name of quirk, Psychic. The description allows the user to use a wide range of psychic abilities. My abilities: Genius level IQ. Time gained, birth. My quirk substantially improves my IQ due to the mental nature of it. Shortly after the initial quirk test, I returned to the hospital to complete the IQ test Nurse Umi said I would have to do. It turns out my exact IQ is 295. It's pretty neat. Photographic memory. Time gained at birth. I'm not 100% sure whether I have this as a result of my quirk or just do, but it's useful. It allows me to recall information extremely accurately after only having seen the source briefly. Probably also one of the reasons I do so well in class. But time gained at birth. This ability allows me to manipulate the emotions of people around me. I've actually been unconsciously using it for a majority of my life, which was a shock to find out. As a result of this ability, I feel emotions a lot stronger than most people, and the emotions of others tend to affect me a lot. It also lets me read people's emotions with ease. Telekinesis. Time gained. The incident allows me to move objects psychically, and this is the ability I'm currently most skilled with. If I'm telekinetically moving an object, it's encased by a green aura. I'm yet to find the weight limit of my telekinesis, and I know that I can lift anything within a 1500 m radius of myself. Mind reading. Time gained. My first time at the dojo. Mom said I actually did this to her before I'd even gone into the dojo, meaning that was the first time it happened. It basically gives me mind reading abilities. I'm really worried because I think it's starting to become passively active. I don't want to encroach on anybody's privacy. Power negation. Time gained. My first time at the dojo. Essentially nullifies or severely weakens some abilities when used against me. It's a natural defense mechanism, and when I'm in perceived danger, my body automatically turns it on. I've discovered it only works on emitter quirks as well as some transformation quirks. It's completely ineffective on mutant types. This is actually what happened in my match against Kumayami. When his scythe was supposed to paralyze me, it simply phased through me instead of doing anything. Pyrokinesis. Time gained. My first time at the dojo. This ability gives me extremely good control over fire, fire resistance, and the ability to create fire. Over the time I've spent training this ability at the dojo, I've discovered there are actually 3 types of flames I can create. Green flames. These are my go-to and what appear naturally if I summon fire. They're easy to control, and I can change the temperature of them from barely any heat to really hot. I can also make them burn brighter or dimmer. The second type of fire is white flames. These flames are controlled and don't emit any heat whatsoever. They're healing flames. I can use them to heal myself. I don't think I can use it on others yet. The final flames are black flames, wild and uncontrollable. If my black flames burn something, it literally just disintegrates. Note to self: never use black flames on people or in a wooded environment. This ability makes me feel at home in a fire, but I'm nowhere near as much of a pyromaniac as Akari. Teleportation. Time gained. My first time at the dojo, Sakura match. This power gives me the ability to teleport, and it's really useful, but I find it really hard to control. It's definitely going to help me in the future, but for now I need to sort it out. According to others, I briefly turn invisible after I teleport for about 5 seconds. I'm calling this phenomenon invisible flashes. I've come to the conclusion that I'm probably not turning invisible, and it's my quirk tricking everybody's brains into simply passing over me. I think I could turn them off if I tried. Levitation. Time gained. During a nightmare. Enables me to hover just above the ground. I love this ability so much. It's so easy and fun to do, and it saves me from having to walk. Definitely how I'm going to go around on a day-to-day basis. Smiley face. Psychic constructs. Time gained. During a nightmare. Lets me create close to anything using just my thoughts. The way that you can tell if something's a psychic construct and not a true object is by looking out for the faint glow on it. I tend to use this ability to make weapons. I can even create completely new things or things from TV shows, as long as I understand how the object works. The objects disappear when I want them to. They're completely solid. I haven't found the limit to what I can create yet, but I doubt I'd be able to make something huge like a submarine or a car. Illusion manipulation. Time gained. During a nightmare. I'm able to breathe a white mist which I can form into illusions. Initially I struggled a lot with this ability, however more often than not, I'm able to form the mist now. Making the illusions once it's there is a piece of cake. I just have to think about what I want others to see. Telepathy. Time learned. The quirk test. My meeting with mind. Grants me the ability to speak with other people telepathically. I can make a web and speak with multiple people at once. When I do this, I can choose whether or not the other people connected can hear each other. Brainwashing. Time learned. The quirk test. My meeting with mind. I can brainwash someone without them being given any warning. All it takes for me to do it is winning a mental clash of wills. I envision this as a tug of war. When I win, I take the rope that grants the person control over their body. To wake the person up, return the rope. The suggestive. In the suggestive, a person is awake but still under the effects of the brainwashing. This occurs if you wake somebody up by ordering them awake, thus giving them their conscience and control back. If you were to order about someone in the suggestive state, they would be forced to do what you told them to do, but they would think that it was their idea. The suggestive state is something that can be held for a long period of time. Psychic resistance. Time learned, the Quirk test, my meeting with mind. I have a natural resistance to psychic abilities. This can't be turned off. It's impossible for another psychic to do something offensive or intrusive to me, such as brainwashing or mind reading. Only some psychics actually have this ability. An example of someone who doesn't is mind. I was able to brainwash her, however, she was completely unable to brainwash me. It's really useful. Psyblast. Time learned, the Quirk test, my meeting with mind. Allows me to create then expel concentrated blasts of energy from my mind. I have to use my hands to output the energy though. It's definitely an offensive skill. Since I first learned how to do it, I've improved drastically due to actually practicing this ability at the dojo. I'm now able to shoot these on the fly and even make pointer guns from my fingers. Enhanced senses. Status. Passively active. Basically what the name says. All of my senses are enhanced and considerably better than the average person's. Enhanced reflexes plus extrasensory perception and movement prediction. Status. Passively active. My reflexes are drastically improved. It's really useful for dodging out of the way of things. I also have ESP. This ability is a godsend. I'm able to sense exactly when and where attacks are going to come from, letting me react accordingly and dodge them. ESP is not truly passively active. Although it's always there, I've got to concentrate to use it properly. Danger sense. Status. Passively active. I'm granted a sixth, danger sense. It basically alerts me whenever I'm about to be in a dangerous situation or when trouble is going to show up. Precognition and retrocognition. Time gained. Literally in the middle of class. Storytime. I was slowly dozing off in class one day as I'd completed the work and the teacher said I could do whatever I wanted, when I suddenly saw a vision. It was into the future and I saw our teacher handing us all pop quizzes. I looked at the time in the vision and realized it was going to be just after lunch. Later on, Kaken and I walked out from a pop quiz extremely happy with ourselves while the rest of the class seemed that much more dead inside. Of course I told Kaken it was coming. He spent his lunch reviewing the notes. Either way it was a win. Back to the actual ability. I'm essentially granted random visions of relevant events from both the future and the past. I can't control when the visions come and I doubt I'll ever actually be able to, but it's a useful ability to have. Anyway, I think I'm going to wrap this entry up here. That's everything that I currently know about my quirk. I'll probably write about any interesting events that happen in here, and I'll definitely write about all the new features of my quirk as they roll in. Izuku was doing really well. It had been 5 months since he'd started going to the dojo and he had great control over a majority of the different aspects of his quirk. Sakura was happy with his physical progress and he was a lot faster than he was when he first began. His social life was thriving. Basically everyone who went to the dojo loved him, and when he'd received a phone from his mother 2 months ago, he had been bombarded with new phone numbers. He had managed to basically entirely patch up his relationship with Bakugo, and if anyone saw them together, they would never suspect the boys had been enemies at any point at all. Obviously they were still rivals, but that was to be expected. His relationship with his other 2 best friends Inesa and Kumiyami was great as well. At some point, Kumiyami had started calling him Mito, and he in return had taken to calling the boy Yami, which the edgelord had no objections to. Tomorrow was going to be one of the few occasions that Izuku, Yami, and Inesa all were free to hang out with each other. They had agreed to meet up and train at the dojo before spending the rest of the day together at the local mall. Izuku had invited Bakugo to the event as well, but the blonde had swiftly declined, mumbling something along the lines of, "The hags grounded me for a year for being an ass." Although he'd felt bad for his friend, Izuku couldn't help but find that pretty funny. The next day, Izuku left for the dojo slightly earlier than necessary. He'd taken a bunch of cash with him as well for the trip later. He left a note on the table for his mom in case she got home early before heading out. 12:50 his phone read. The green-haired boy arrived at the dojo 10 minutes before Sakura actually opened it. Realizing his mistake, he sighed and sat up on a nearby brick wall, clearing the snow which had gathered there and igniting a small fire to warm himself up. He found himself playing games on his phone about a minute into the wait. He needed a way to entertain himself after all. 5 minutes later, a shout interrupted Izuku, who'd been completely immersed in his phone. "Hey, I thought I would be the first one here," Inesa yelled jovially. Izuku chuckled, "Well, I guess not, I beat you to it." The friends made small talk and jokes for another 5 minutes before Sakura finally arrived. "Hey guys, I'm happy that you're in so early. I think we're going to leave the proper training out until later. I want to see you spar and see how much better you've become over the past few months." The two boys nodded, happy to comply. They'd originally intended on sparring today anyway. Sakura thanked them and unlocked the doors, pocketing the key and leading the pair into the welcoming space of the dojo. "All right then, both of you, get in the ring. I want one match without you using your quirks and one match with you using them." The boys warmed up and then entered the ring, facing each other. "May the best man win," Inesa shouted over to Izuku, who just nodded his head, mentally preparing himself. "Start." Izuku ran towards the center of the ring where he and Inesa clashed, jabbing at each other, parrying and punching. The two were pretty evenly matched in terms of physical combat. What Inesa had in brute strength, Izuku made up for in his speed, spectacular reaction times and quick thinking. Sakura had given them a time limit of 5 minutes. When the time limit finally passed, it was obvious to all three people in the room that there was no apparent winner. Neither of the boys had been defeated. "All right, I've got to say, that was really impressive, guys. I'm happy with that. Let's move on to the quirk match." Izuku grinned once she said it. Nobody, not even himself, knew the full extent of his capabilities, and he'd been able to get to the finals before even when he had barely any control. He was pumped for this rematch against Inesa. "You may begin." Rather than waiting for Inesa to pull his "I'm going to push you" out of the ring the second we begin trick, Izuku speedily ran along the width. He suddenly felt a gust of wind hurtling towards him, and he teleported out of the way. In the invisible flash afterwards, he created an illusion of himself, throwing off Inesa, who aimed the winds at the decoy while the real Izuku attacked him, punching him from behind. Inesa stumbled, quickly regaining his balance and lifting himself up onto a mini tornado which Izuku promptly destroyed telekinetically. Inesa was about to go in for another attack when his mind suddenly went blank. "Inesa, please walk out of the ring." A few seconds later, and Inesa looked up only to find himself outside of the ring. He was utterly stumped as to how he got there, but he willingly accepted the result, bowing to his friend. And Izuku Midoriya wins the match. Suddenly, Izuku and Inesa heard clapping from behind them and turned to see 3 more people had entered the dojo. Akari, Kai and Yami had all been watching the second match from the door as to cause as little distraction as possible. "Oh whoa guys, that was really cool," Kai spoke, his chill attitude helping to de-escalate the adrenaline of the fight. "Thanks Yamoto," Izuku called back. It wasn't bad, but I could put up a better show," Akari mumbled. "Oi Midori, I'm going up against you next," she shrieked. "Sure thing Hatru, I can't wait for us to go head-to-head using our pyrokinesis abilities." "Tisich, I'm still gonna win, but you better put up a good fight," she smirked. That would be an interesting match to watch. "Do your best, Mido, present us with a mad banquet of darkness?" Yami encouraged his friend coolly. "Well, in that case Akari, you'll be facing Izuku in a quirk match next." Sakura's voice reverberated off of the walls. Izuku smiled inwardly. Akari was one of the people he'd become closest with in his time at the dojo. After he'd unlocked his pyrokinesis, they'd begun training together and she taught him some handy tricks. Personality-wise, she wasn't all that different from Kaken, although she was a lot more fire-obsessed. The two would probably get on like a house on fire now that he thought about it. All right then. The pyromaniac and the psychic stood face to face in the ring. The second Sakura began the match, the dojo became a sauna. The temperature rose so high that the others in the room were struggling. Izuku and Akari were running loops around each other, their fires dancing and colliding at every turn. Beautiful rivers of crimson and emerald. Akari could create hotter, more dangerous flames than Izuku could without having to worry about losing control, while Izuku on the other hand could easily take control of her flames, turning the red to green and forcing her to create more. A process that wore Akari down in a time period a lot shorter than normal. Akari suddenly flung a flurry of fireballs at Izuku. However, he simply dodged them with the help of his ESP. Noticing Akari was getting more and more sluggish as the match drew on due to her drawback, Izuku opted to end the match quickly and grabbed her using his telekinesis before dropping her outside of the ring. Izuku wins again. Sakura whistled. Akari looked annoyed, angry, and defeated. I thought, we agreed, it was supposed to be a pyrokinesis only match? She managed to choke out as she fell to her knees, feeling the drawback in its fullest capacity. Yeah, I know, and I'm sorry I went against that, but you were overexerting yourself. If I didn't do it, your overheating would probably have been a lot worse than it is now. Izuku said while walking over to her, white flames glowing on his fingertips. Wait a second, I'm going to fix this. He brought the white flame up to Akari, who had almost passed out. They'd worked on that part of his quirk together as well, and he'd learned enough from working with her to be able to use the fire to heal others. Akari stood again, feeling cool and refreshed. She nodded to the greenette. Thanks for that, Midori, but I promise you next time. Just you wait, next time I'll beat you. No problem, Hataru, and yup, I'm looking forward to it. Alright, so who's Midoriya going to face next? Kumiyami, Yamoto, decide between yourselves? Sakura boomed. After a very short discussion, the two came to the agreement Yamoto would go first. Alright, Midoriya. I brought my guitar along today, so this should be fun. Kai grinned as he pressed a button on his headphones and they started flashing. Izuku was slightly worried about the match as he'd never faced Kai before, and he seemed like a challenging opponent when he was in his element. He took a deep breath and got ready for the match to start. If he played his cards right, he knew he could win. The two boys faced each other and the match began. Izuku rushed ahead trying to get an advantage while Kai simply tapped his foot on the ground. Izuku was confused until the whole floor started pulsing up and down in time with the other boy's foot. We love heavy bass, you dig? Kai grinned. Izuku levitated, not wanting to be thrown off by the beats in the ground. He looked over to see Yamoto unstrapping his guitar. The laid-back boy softly strummed a couple of notes. A soft smile on his face before the smile widened into something evil-looking, and he started playing a mad riff crazily fast. The second the mad solo had started, Izuku had been forced on the defensive. With each note played, a beam of energy would leave the guitar. Modified by a support company to be lethal, Jesus Christ, that's cool. Midoriya internally screeched. The sheer volume of the instrument was making Izuku reel. His enhanced sense of hearing wasn't doing him any favors on that one. I need to get rid of that guitar. Izuku teleported out of the way of an incoming beam and telekinetically grabbed the guitar, taking it away from the musician and dropping it out of bounds where the other boy couldn't reach it. Despite his usually laid-back attitude, Izuku had expected the other boy to panic at least a bit at that blow. He'd been rather surprised when the other boy had just shrugged it off. From his pocket, Kai had then pulled out a speaker. Izuku took one look at it and felt himself cringe. The musician smirked lazily. I guess I'll make your life hell, Midoriya. Not today, thanks. Izuku grabbed onto the speaker telekinetically and flung it across the dojo. The boy who'd previously been wielding it swiftly followed. Okay then, Izuku wins the match. Kumiyami, you're up next. I'm really sorry to interrupt Sakura, but please may Yarashi, Kumiyami and I take our leave now. We'd already planned and agreed with our parents that we'd have to leave early. The other two boys nodded, confirming what he was saying. Alright then, Kumiyami. You're not off the hook. You're sparring against Midoriya next time you're both here. Kumiyami nodded again to the woman. Well, I'll see you when I see you, punks. The trio said their goodbyes to Akari and Kai before they left the dojo. The second they left, Kumiyami heaved a huge sigh of relief. What was that for, Yami? Izuku asked, curious. It's irrelevant, just, I know I couldn't have fought you today. Elaborate? Kumiyami sighed. Recently my quirk has fallen into a state of utter entropy. The chaos is immeasurable. I have no idea what's going on with it, but I'm praying to the demons that I can revel in the darkness comfortably soon. Izuku hummed while Inesa rambled loud reassurances to his friend. They set out on the road. It was a long way to the mall after all. 2 hours later, the trio arrived in the city and began to walk around the mall. They chatted, talking about all kinds of things, from school to the dojo to which clubs they might want to join. Izuku wanted to do dance, Masayoshi wanted to try baking, and Inesa had been interested in baseball. The weather was cold outside and the sky was darkening rapidly. Christmas was almost upon them. Yami and Inesa both needed to buy things for people, so they decided they would walk around together in the beginning and then split up before finding a place to eat and then going home. The three executed the plan. They started off by buying themselves huge mugs of hot chocolate to keep warm before going their own separate ways. Izuku found himself wandering through a hero merch store, looking through figurines, when he came to two cool ones. On a display board, he found a mind figurine which he'd been charmed by. Close to the exit of the store, he found a bunch of Endeavor figures and picked one up. He only glanced over the All Might figures for a second before checking out the other two and leaving. Since his meeting with All Might, Izuku had openly given up his obsession. His room walls were entirely black, devoid of posters, and he'd given all his All Might merch away. Whenever he went shopping, he didn't even look twice if he saw All Might-themed things. He knew he'd forgive the number one in time, but he still couldn't bring himself to look at the man yet. Izuku left the store and walked around the mall alone. The only thing he'd really wanted to do was check out hero merch. He'd already bought all of his Christmas presents well in advance. The greenette didn't want to interrupt his friends, so he simply sat on a bench, waiting. Izuku sat alone for about 20 minutes before he decided he was bored as well as hungry. The green-haired boy didn't want to go back on his agreement to eat with the other two, so he decided he was going to buy himself a snack. He knew that a few streets down from the mall, there was a little parlor which sold cheap but delicious ice cream, and despite it being winter, Izuku wanted in on it. The greenette walked out of the busy shopping center and into the cold air outside. The streets were littered with people and the sky had gone from a light blue to an overbearing black. Izuku walked along the roads at a casual pace. He knew he had a bit of time left, so he could probably make the trip if he took a shortcut. There was a way to get to the parlor faster if you passed through a few backstreet alleys. They were slightly dodgy, but Izuku knew they were probably the best option. Crossing into the darkness of the first alley, Izuku started to feel his gut shaking. It wasn't normal, but he'd gotten used to it, his danger sense. There was something or someone dangerous nearby. Izuku was perfectly ready to walk back out of the alleyway and towards the mall when he heard something that made him freeze. There was a kid shouting for help. Before his brain could even process what was happening, his legs moved him forward, towards the area he'd been attempting to avoid just seconds earlier. Slightly further down the alley and deeper into the darkness, Izuku realized he'd found what he was looking for. His gut almost led him to the source of the problem. On the ground, a child who couldn't have been much older than him laid, steadily bleeding out. A tall, sinister-looking man was hunched over the boy, two large blades drawn and bloodied. "Fine. Just end me then. The world's stupid anyway." The kid panted out, indignation evident in his tone. The man smirked, wild eyes fixed on his target. "As you wish, boy. I will not accept fake heroes tarnishing our society. Be that heroes in training, or hero hopefuls. I will exterminate you all," he stated coldly. The man's eyes flashed. "Now die." The boy shut his eyes tightly, waiting for the impact, for the knife to dig into his chest, carve its way into his heart, and for him to finally fade away and have some peace. When the finishing blow didn't come after a few seconds, he slowly cracked his eyes open only to see his attacker staring into space, slack-jawed and eyes unfocused. He couldn't have done it. What if he did, though? Jesus, his cursed quirk was even working without him speaking now. The freak should have just ended him. The villain swiveled his head to look at the opposite side of the street. The wounded boy followed his line of vision and gasped when he saw himself lying on the ground over there. The villain stood over him, stabbing him again and again in the chest. He watched as his own eyes dulled and the life left them. "What the hell, am I dead then?" he wondered to himself, slightly mortified. "No, I promise you're not," someone else replied. "Alright, so I guess I'm dead and I'm going crazy as I'm hearing voices in my head." The wounded boy chuckled bitterly to himself, frozen on the ground. The other voice sighed, "I'll explain this in a second." The wounded child waited for an explanation but instead was shocked to hear the other voice out loud. "Hey, you ended the boy is dead. Now, you're going to walk away from here without hurting anybody else and go back to wherever you came from. When you return there, I order you to wake up and forget everything else about this encounter." The wounded boy turned his head slightly to see it was a green-haired kid who'd been talking. The cruel man's face remained slack as he listened to the greenette and promptly followed his orders, leaving the two boys alone in the alleyway. "Hey, sorry about that. It must suck to watch yourself being ended." The greenette laughed nervously. He looked more closely at the wounded boy, only now seeing all of the deep gashes, cuts and lacerations which decorated his pale skin. It was worse than he had previously thought. "Oh my God, there's so much blood, this could probably be life-threatening. I've got to take you to a hospital." He panicked. The boy looked straight into Izuku's eyes, dark purple orbs meeting emerald ones, and spoke. "Just leave me here, I want to die anyway. You should have just let him end me." Izuku thought for only a second before replying. "If you really wanted to die, then why did you call out for help?" "Reflex. I didn't need your help. You don't know anything about me, for goodness sake. You don't know how terrible my life is. You don't know about my cursed quirk. You don't know anything, so just leave me alone." The wounded boy practically screamed at Izuku before struggling to regain his breath. Izuku knew he could probably find out all of the missing information with ease, but he didn't want to make the fragile situation more fragile. "Tell me about it then." The boy began to tell his story. He told Izuku of how ever since he'd gained his quirk, his parents had hated him, been afraid of him. They didn't want anything to do with him. When he went to school, the kids there bullied him. They didn't want to be friends with someone who had a villain's quirk. They told him he was going to grow up evil. He'd never had any friends, he hated his life. The only dream he'd ever had was to become a hero, and everyone saw that as nothing more than a joke. Even the villain didn't believe he could ever be a true hero. By the time he was done, hot tears rolled down his face, becoming red as they met with the cuts that marred him. He had no idea why he was spilling his whole heart and soul to a complete stranger, but for some reason, he felt at ease. "Hey, look, this quirk of yours, it can't be villainous. There's no such thing as a villainous quirk, it's the user that makes it what it is. I mean, look at All Might. Everyone thinks super strength is really cool because of him, but if he was evil, they'd treat anyone with strength augmentation quirks like the plague. What exactly is your quirk, Purple?" Izuku decided to dub the other boy Purple. His eyes were purple, his wild hair was purple, even the prominent bags under his eyes were purple. Purple looked down. "You would probably leave and just let me die if you knew." "No, I wouldn't. I would be no better than that man from just now if I did." Purple took a deep breath. "I brainwash people." Purple turned his head down to face the floor in shame, not wanting to see the disgust on the green-haired boy's face. He waited for the verbal abuse and hatred to come his way. "Yeah, so do I. What about it?" The purple-haired boy snapped his head up to look at the green-haired boy once again, astonished. "My story isn't all that different to yours actually. I was a late bloomer, and because everyone thought I was quirkless, they bullied me for years. My parents still loved me, but my dad works abroad and my mum didn't know. I finally unlocked my quirk a few months ago, and do you know what I'm trying to do? Become a hero." "Exactly. Tell me, Purple, how did I stop that guy from ending you?" "You brainwashed him and told him to leave us alone?" "Exactly. Your quirk is a powerful one. It could save you and others in so many situations. I know it may be hard, but I want you to try to love it. Ignore all the people who shoot you down and go plus ultra." Izuku smiled at him. Purple's eyes widened as he listened to the greenette. He found himself agreeing with what he was saying. There wasn't any hostility or malice behind the words, just sheer compassion. "Hey, I'm shooting for you today and I expect to see you there too. So enough with this I deserve to die thing, because we both know it isn't true." Purple looked at him and nodded, a fire long dead reignited in his eyes. "Good, when the going gets tough, know that you'll get through. When people say that you've got no friends, know that I'll always be supporting you. No matter what happens, look at life straight in the face and smirk knowing you can conquer it, defeat it." The fire in Purple's eyes had become an inferno and he chuckled slightly as he began to speak. You have no idea who I am and yet you put yourself in a whole bunch of danger to save me. You then proceeded to give me the most motivational talk I've ever had in my life and agreed to being friends with someone like me. All of this despite my villainous quirk. You're either extremely heroic or a complete and utter idiot. He spoke again with conviction. I'm getting into you, no matter what any of them say. Thanks for helping me realize that, you idiot. He smiled softly and the fire that had been burning so brightly in his eyes seconds earlier began to rapidly fade. Purple's eyes began to unfocus and flutter shut. No, Eno, keep your eyes open. Izuku ran to the other boy and grabbed him gently before closing his eyes and teleporting. He knew exactly where he was headed. Hey buddy, stay with me. Keep your eyes open for just a little bit longer. Purple seemed to be treading a fine line between consciousness and unconsciousness. Izuku had a bad feeling that if the other boy was to give in and close his eyes, despite him realizing he had hope and things to live for, he'd never be able to open them again. The pair appeared in the staff room of the local hospital. Many doctors and nurses seemed shocked by their sudden appearance. Doctors, nurses, anyone, please help him. He's almost dead, dang it. Please do something. He only just found something to live for. Izuku cried desperately. The hospital faculty all seemed to jolt out of their shocked stupors at that, and the room immediately became a frenzy of doctors and nurses running to gain equipment for surgery. Hey Purple, you're doing so well. Just don't fall asleep on me, okay? Just stay awake a little longer. Fight a little longer, okay? He begged. Izuku could feel his own tears spilling down his face. The story that the other boy had told him resonated so much with something inside of him. He could relate on a spiritual level to almost everything Purple had said. The other boy needed to survive. He had to. The doctors had taken Purple through to a different room and begun operating on him. Izuku stayed in the closest waiting room. A nurse came out to see him not long after that. Hello, young man, may I begin by saying congratulations to you for a job well done. Even a few seconds later, and the poor boy in there would almost certainly be dead by now. Izuku let out a sigh of relief that he didn't know he'd been holding, though he still couldn't stop crying. He's in critical condition right now and he's unstable. We've managed to call his parents, however, they'll probably take a while to get here. Due to the fact you're not family, you won't be able to see the patient, however, we've all decided to let you stay here until he's stable. Izuku nodded to the nurse. Thank you. As the nurse left the room, Izuku realized he'd left his bag and phone with Inesa back at the mall. He simply couldn't be bothered to carry them, and his friend had offered. He looked at the time and realized that he should have met up with the others close to an hour ago. They're probably panicking. Izuku mused to himself. The likelihood was the two had called his mom and all three of them were panicking together. Izuku sighed, slightly worried before he had an idea. He'd telepathically communicated with Inesa and Yami so many times over the past few months that it was basically second nature. Maybe, just maybe, he could try to do it over long distances? Izuku tried and tried to find his friends, mentally calling out to either of them when, oh my god, I can't believe I've lost my best friend like this. That is not passionate at all. Inesa mentally screeched at himself. I must admit I'm worried for Mido's safety. Such terrible darkness is heavy upon my heart. If he gets into any trouble, though, he could probably defend himself. He can't be dead. I would know if he was. Kumiyami's calmer thoughts drifted into Izuku's ears. Guys, I'm fine. At the mall, Yami and Inesa both jumped and looked at each other. Izuku wasn't sure if they could hear him, but he carried on. I basically got into a sticky situation with a villain and had to help a kid out. I took him to the hospital and now I'm in a waiting room trying not to have a meltdown. Yami and Inesa both stared at each other. I'm not going mad, am I? You did hear Mido just now as well, Inesa, right? Yes, I did. He even found a way to tell us what happened to him when he forgot his phone. So passionate. Yami sighed and responded. Fine, we'll call your mom again to inform her you haven't fallen and become one with the void. We can also keep this link running if it helps you. Thanks, Yami. Izuku replied shakily. After Inesa and Yami had made the call, they sat on a bench and spoke mentally with Izuku for a while. Yami had noticed his friend was upset but didn't know what to do. Inesa decided to try something. Guys, I want to know even more about you both, so let's ask questions that we've got to answer truthfully. Inesa mentally shouted. Alright then, but I'm starting. Izuku laughed softly. Inesa, why do you hate Endeavor? Izuku asked. I don't hate Endeavor. Inesa thought surprisingly. Quietly. No lies. Fine. It's very hard for me to hate somebody, as you two probably know by now. I used to be a huge Endeavor fan, but the one time I met him, he told me to get out of his way like I was nothing more than a piece of trash. The way he looked at me, there was no passion in it. His eyes looked so dead. People like that shouldn't be heroes. The other two were mildly surprised to hear that, but thinking about Endeavor's personality on the whole, it wasn't too shocking. Alright then, I'm taking a turn. Kumiyami started. Mido, why do you always hold back when you spar against everyone? Don't lie and say you don't. I can tell when people aren't giving it their all. Because I want to give everyone the chance to improve. I'm not trying to brag, but if I didn't hold back, likelihood is I could end a majority of my matches seconds after they began, which would be unfair on everyone else. Yami was fairly satisfied with the answer. My turn. Inesa shouted down the link. Kumiyami, can you actually fully explain your quirk for once? You always dodge our questions. Wouldn't believe me if I did. Or if you did, you'd be sure to leave me to revel in the dark alone, and I've come to enjoy your company. Come on, Yami, have more faith in us. Which D never do that to you. Izuku replied, and Kumiyami mentally sighed. Stop being such a creature of the light, Mido. You're ruining my darkness. Midoriya just laughed at his friend's playful annoyance. Anyway, I'll divulge into the nature of my quirk just for you two. Firstly, there's my scythe, which you already know about. If I strike anyone with it, they're paralyzed for varying times depending on how dangerous they are. A civilian would be paralyzed for 5 minutes, a hero or someone I'm sparring against for 10, and a normal villain for about 30, I believe. A normal villain? I was just getting on to that, Mido. I think after a large number of terrible crimes, the effects of my scythe change. After darkness has completely consumed a person, they shall be dragged into the deepest depths of the abyss. What? Could I ask for that translated? Yami sighed. Fine, you uncultured swine. I could probably end someone if they'd committed enough sins. You can cancel the effects, right? I can. The edgelord confirmed. That's really interesting, Kumiyami. Anything else? I can see and speak to the dead. That explains so much. I don't think you understand. Izuku's voice filled the other boys' minds. Huh. Yami, I literally thought you were part of a cult and just chose to trust you weren't going around ending people. You literally think about ghosts more often than you think about humans. It also explains you just randomly staring into space or at walls or seemingly having conversations with nothing. I am part of a cult, but was I really that noticeable? Kumiyami, you shouldn't be a part of a cult at such a young age. But Izuku, I didn't even realize any of those things. All reason is eclipsed to allow for revelry in the dark, Kumiyami shrugged. Okay, Yami. But it was probably just me overanalyzing people and situations then. Nobody else ever mentioned it, so you probably weren't noticeable. Izuku said. Hey, before I forget. You know how we were all talking about clubs we'd want to join? Well, Kumiyami and I saw a poster for a dance studio nearby. Classes start up again after Christmas. Oh, thanks guys. That's so nice of you, I'll definitely check it out. It was then that the nurse walked back into the room. Hello again, we believe the boy is in fairly stable condition. There's no chance that he's going to die, although his recovery will be slow. Izuku thanked her and began to make his way out of the hospital and back home. He decided to talk with Inesa and Yami on the way. They were making it at least a bit bearable. When he arrived back at his door, he tried to sever the connection as he normally did when he was finished talking telepathically with someone, but when he did, he sank to his knees crying out in pain. His head felt like it was splitting in two. Izuku/Mido, are you okay? Izuku's breathing was ragged and it took him a minute or two to recover before he responded. Yeah, I'm fine. I can't sever the connection. It physically hurts? He mentally murmured. Don't cut it then. We're coming over to check up on you. Yami said the last bit so harshly that it was almost venomous. He was daring Inasa to challenge him. Why we're coming over? Inasa declared, quickly regaining his composure. Izuku laughed tiredly. I'll probably be in the shower when you guys arrive, so use the key under the doormat. Also Inasa, please bring my stuff. No need Izuku. Mrs. Midoriya gave both of you's house keys already. It's true, last time we were over. Your mother really is a true creature of the light to be protected, Yami thought. How in the world was I unaware of this? Both Yami and Inasa laughed at his antics. Anyway, we'll see you in a few minutes, Mido. 15 minutes and a hot shower later, the three boys sat around Izuku's dining table. Okay then Mido, kindly explain to us exactly what happened to you today. Izuku sighed. You guys were taking forever to get your gifts, so I decided to head out of the mall to the parlor for ice cream. Kumiyami raised an eyebrow at his choice of snack in the cold weather but remained silent. I didn't want to meet up with you guys late, so I decided to take the shortcut. Wait. The dodgy shortcut down the back streets? Izuku, it was dark though. That's so dangerous. Yurashi scolded. You're literally the smartest person I know and yet you do things like this? What kind of chaotic idiocy? Yami face-bombed. Hee, Izuku laughed sheepishly. Anyway, my danger sense started going off but I heard a kid shouting for help and I ran to help him. Fair enough. The kid was being attacked by a man wielding knives and he was bleeding out. I brainwashed the villain and forced him to leave. I then talked him out of a suicidal mood and teleported him to hospital. Geez Izuku, that's intense. Inasa shouted. Mido. Yes Yami? Please tell me you told the villain to hand himself in to the authorities and you didn't just tell him to leave and shroud himself in mystery and shadows once again? Dang it. I completely forgot I could do that. Izuku yelled. You literally let a endless psycho walk away free. Kumiyami face-bombed again. How did I not think of that? Izuku moaned, cringing at his mistake. Anyway, you guys basically know the rest. Purple is stable though, so that's a relief. Purple? Yami inquired. The boy. Izuku replied matter-of-factly. Mido, can I just ask? How in the world are you so calm about this? You literally just encountered a dangerous villain and saved a dying boy. I expected you to be drowning in the dark. Oh yeah, I was a mess earlier, it's probably my empathy though. You guys are currently keeping me calm, so thanks for that. The other two nodded in understanding. I'm going to call Mind about the situation with the telepathic link though. Maybe she can explain. Izuku grabbed his phone and keyed in a number. The phone rang once, twice before the other psychic picked up. Hello little one, is everything alright? Hey Mind, yeah everything's good, I just need to ask a question. Oh okay, go for it. Well today I tried long-distance telepathy and I managed to do it. Oh well done little one, that's quite the impressive feat. Izuku laughed. The only problem is I can't seem to sever the... It physically pains me to do it. Mind hummed, I'm fairly sure I know what's going on here, my mentor could do it but I can't. If I'm guessing correctly, you just made your first mental link. Huh. Essentially you'll be able to speak telepathically with that person at any time. You could feel what they feel and see what they see. It's a two-way thing though, so the same applies to the person. Is there any way I can sever it? You tried, you tell me? She chuckled. Nope, I don't believe so. Exactly, the first 3 mental links you make are permanent. You're stuck with them. After that, you can make them but they'll naturally dissolve after a few hours or you can just sever them. I've already made 2 accidentally, meaning I've got 1 permanent, 1 left. Choose who you pick extremely carefully then little one. A mind, is there any way for me to almost turn it off though? I don't want to randomly intrude on my friends' lives all the time. Oh yes, it isn't really an intrusive type of thing little one, it only works if the other person wants you to be able to see what they see. The emotion part of it is passively active though, you'll both know how the other person in the link feels. Okay, I think I get it, maybe? Thanks Mind. No problem little one, have a nice evening. Izuku hung up the phone and turned to his friends who were glancing at him with questioning expressions. I basically accidentally formed permanent mental links with both of you. He laughed nervously. What kind of chaos does that entail? Kumiyami sighed tiredly. Basically, we can communicate telepathically over long distances, feel each other's true emotions, and send each other visions of what we're seeing. Oh wow, that's really cool. If I were to look at this table here and imagine messaging Izuku. Yup, got it, the greenette replied. If this is permanent, then it could come in useful. We're all going to become pro-heroes when we're older, right? Kumiyami asked. You bet I am. Inasa shouted enthusiastically. Without a doubt. Izuku nodded. If any of us are ever kidnapped, we could literally send back our location to one of the others. If we're across the city from each other, we could still inform each other of what's going on where we are. Hostage situation, we could call each other for backup without moving our lips. When you put it like that, Yami, it does seem like an actual blessing. Izuku smiled. This'll make you even better heroes. Thank you for the privilege of this link, Izuku. Inasa did his classic Inasa bow, banging his head right into the ground. And if we're ever training against each other, we can temporarily shut it or block each other out because both sides need to be aware. It's a win-win situation, guys. Izuku mumbled. Despite everything that's happened today, we've still gained something valuable. Guys, Mom's working late tonight and I don't really feel like being an emotional wreck right now. As I said earlier, my empathy is the only thing keeping me calm, and that's because you guys are calm. Do you want to stay over the night? The two boys quickly made calls home to inform their parents they were sleeping over at Izuku's, and all three of them were soon settled and ready to sleep. Guys, thanks for being such great friends. Izuku murmured softly as he drifted off into sleep. No problem, Mido. Yami responded quietly, hearing his best friend snoring already. Anytime, Izuku. Inasa replied softly, also drifting off. Mitsuki Bakugo was a woman who stuck to her word. When she'd said her son was grounded for a year, she'd meant it, and he'd been powerless to do anything about the decision, knowing full well he'd deserved the punishment. That year had expired. Bakugo smirked slightly as he strolled out of the house, warm rays of sunshine streaming onto his face. It was nice to taste freedom again. His mum had only smiled, teasing him fondly as he'd announced he was going out to see Zukin and Auntie Inko. The reunion had been an emotional event and many tears had been shed, mostly by the Midoriyas, but maybe Katsuki's eyes had started sweating a little too. Though he had gotten the scare of his life when Inko had passively-aggressively threatened to attract his skin cells if he were ever to hurt Zukin again. After that, Bakugo and Midoriya had fallen into a habit of seeing each other almost every day. They did a wide range of different things together to try to make up for all the lost time, taking turns to choose activities from day to day. On one such day, it had been Bakugo's turn to choose where they would go, and he took the opportunity to do something he'd wanted to do for a long while. He took Midoriya to a park where quirks weren't prohibited and asked him to spar. Izuku accepted the challenge. That was Bakugo's first attempt. Attempt 1. I hope you're ready for this, Zukin, because I promise you, you're going to die. Bakugo shouted, his excitement getting the better of him. I'm looking forward to it, Kakin. Midoriya smiled back. They both took their positions on opposing sides of the park and then began. Bakugo immediately went on the offensive, starting the sparring match with an explosive right hook, only to miss. Midoriya had completely dodged his strike. Katsuki was frustrated that his initial attack had been avoided, but he carried on. There was no way he was going to lose to the nerd. Bakugo followed up, attacking him with explosion after explosion, but Midoriya simply stepped back each time and dodged somehow or other. 45 minutes later, and Bakugo was getting seriously annoyed. You damn nerd. He panted, almost completely worn out from attacking without a break. I would, but you haven't exactly made me use it. It would probably be more satisfying for you if you were good enough to force me to. Izuku said. He didn't seem to be out of breath in the slightest. Is he saying I'm not good enough? I am going to end this nerd today. Bakugo mentally shrieked before advancing again. Midoriya sighed and dodged his next strike with ease. Nice try, Kakin, he smirked. Try harder. What the hell, when did he get so cocky? Midoriya's smirk seemed to widen in a way that seriously rubbed Bakugo the wrong way. He threw his hands up into the air and summoned a huge explosion which seared his palms as it was sent rocketing towards Izuku. The force of the blast sent Bakugo reeling backwards, colliding hard with a tree. It produced a deafening roar which probably could have been heard for miles. The bright light which ensued completely filled his vision, and he'd be lying if he said an intense feeling of worry hadn't washed over him. No matter which way you turned it, a telekinesis quirk wasn't going to be able to get you out of an explosion that big that quickly. Had he really just ended his best friend? Despite the pain he felt, he'd hit his head pretty hard on the tree. He scrambled up to his feet, about to search for Izuku. If Zu was in critical condition, he could still carry him to a hospital. He could live, right? It didn't matter if he had a concussion, which he probably did. If he could help Izuku after what he'd just done, wow. His thoughts were abruptly stopped when he felt a light pat on his shoulder. You know, if that had hit me, I'd probably be dead, Kaken. Don't overdo it, Izuku said, way too calmly after having nearly been blown up. Katsuki slowly craned his neck to see none other than his basically brother behind him. The park around them had been all but decimated, and yet he stood with not even a scratch on him despite the huge explosion he should have been caught in. But physics, that shouldn't be possible. Zucken, what the actual F dash dot? Bakugo muttered as he fell back to his knees. Izuku had later told Bakugo he'd passed out after that from Quirk exhaustion and a concussion. He'd carried him home. Bakugo found the whole thing humiliating. That day, he'd promised himself that he would beat Izuku in a battle. He made it a goal to force Midoriya's goddamn Quirk out of him. Attempt 2. The second time Katsuki and Izuku sparred was at school. Well, it wasn't exactly sparring. Midoriya had stolen a bottle of Bakugo's hot sauce to see what would happen, and the result of the experiment had been a very angry blonde mercilessly attacking him. Izuku made it fun for himself by dodging his attacks rather than just teleporting away, making use of his ESP and enhanced reflexes. This is exactly what you did at the park. Stop dodging and face me, goddammit. Bakugo yelled as he chased Izuku down the corridors, sending explosions every couple of seconds. Kaken, I love you very much, but I'm not slowing down, Midoriya shouted back, continuing to duck and dodge whilst madly running. Just give me back my hot sauce, Deku, he screeched. Izuku can't remember if he was laughing like an evil mastermind or screaming like a little girl at that point, probably a combination of both. By then, a majority of the school had come to watch the kids fighting over a bottle of hot sauce. I will actually end you, Zucken, give it back. Bakugo screamed. You can't end me if you can't catch me, Kaken, and I have no intention of letting you. Midoriya leapt over a bin and made a dash towards the school roof. Get back here, damn it. Bakugo used his explosions to speedily propel himself through the air and up the stairs. A lot of the student body who decided to make the chase their business ran after him, hoping to get in on the action. Izuku stood precariously on the roof railing, and the bottle of hot sauce dangled loosely in his fingers over the edge, on the verge of falling. Bakugo looked like he wasn't sure whether to attack or fall into despair. Look, Zu, I literally can't eat without it, please? He mumbled, and the whole student body gasped. The Katsuki Bakugo had said please. Izuku was so shocked that he tripped and nearly fell off of the roof. He managed to balance himself, but the hot sauce went plummeting down to the ground. Oops. Damn you, Deku! Bakugo screamed, ricocheting towards him. His face was a mask of rage. Midoriya was slightly scared he was going to blow the whole school up starting with him, so he decided to finally teleport the heck out of there. Not 5 minutes later, Bakugo had found him again, hiding in an empty classroom. The rest of the school was behind him. I will grant you a slow and painful death for what you just did to my hot sauce, Zu. Bakugo's voice was calm, and he smiled at Izuku cheerfully. It was so wrong. Ella, Kaken, I get that the sauce meant a lot to you, but dash. An explosion sounded, cutting him off. Kindly shut up, you've ruined my life. He smiled again, like he was about to commit end. Getting rid of a bottle of hot sauce is ruining your life? That's a bit extra. Izuku mentally sighed. I guess it's because it was the spiciest type. He had 7 other bottles in his bag. I am going to end your existence now. It was nice knowing you, Zu. The crackling of his quirk started, and Izuku could see small embers and sparks flying around his fingertips. He wasn't joking. Wait, just a second, Kaken. Midoriya yelled, panicked. You didn't wait to throw my beloved hot sauce off a roof. Why the hell do you think I should wait and listen to you? He screamed. The explosions in his hands seemed to be getting louder as he charged them up. "Because I didn't throw your hot sauce off the roof," Izuku shouted back, desperately. "You damn liar, I saw it with my own 2 eyes." Bakugo shrieked. "I'm not lying, what you saw me drop wasn't your hot sauce. It was a psychic construct." "The F is that, and where's my goddamn hot sauce then?" "It's part of my quirk and I've literally got the hot sauce right here. Chill out, please," Izuku begged. "And over," he grumbled darkly, the explosions dancing in his palms dying down. Izuku fished out the bottle from his pocket and Bakugo hastily snatched it before marching to the door. Midoriya almost puffed out a sigh of relief before Bakugo suddenly stopped and turned to pierce him with a glare. "We're going to talk about this later," he hissed and turned on his heel, slamming the door behind him. He finally released the sigh of relief when he was gone. "Dang, I might be able to fight Kaken and win, but that doesn't make him any less scary when he wants to be," Izuku shivered. Attempt 3. The last time Bakugo and Midoriya sparred was on their final day at Kitsuhara Elementary. The second the final bell rang signaling the end of classes, Bakugo had dragged the greenette towards an abandoned building so they could duke it out. Was it because he wasn't going to start a new school without winning? Yes. Was it also because he needed revenge for the hot sauce incident? Definitely. In addition to that, when Bakugo had questioned Midoriya about the hot sauce incident, he'd explained his quirk, well, the telekinesis and teleportation parts of it anyway. He'd had the audacity to not even bother explaining the psychic constructs or anything else for that matter, and Katsuki knew there was more. He was going to force that quirk out of him, even if it ended him. As the two approached the building, Midoriya took in Bakugo's steely expression. He was struggling not to laugh at the other boy's thoughts, though he was impressed by just how determined he was. Looking over his best friend, Izuku realized Bakugo must have been taking the challenge seriously. Although he didn't go to the dojo or anything like it, he seemed to have built up some muscle, and he wouldn't be surprised if Bakugo's quirk had gotten stronger as well with training. He was excited for the showdown. He still didn't think he'd have to fight with his quirk though. The pair finally arrived and took up positions on opposing sides of the building. "May the best man win," Izuku called to Bakugo, who just laughed. Yeah, Bakugo said before charging in with his usual explosive right hook. Midoriya saw this coming from a mile away and easily sidestepped it. Bakugo, however, anticipating this, had quickly used an explosion to change direction in midair and went ricocheting towards Izuku again, hand raised to throw an explosion in his face. Midoriya jumped back, only just avoiding it. Katsuki looked into Izuku's eyes for a second before nodding to him himself and nimbly avoiding a harsh kick that probably would have been painful. His eyes narrowed as he began to enact his newfound strategy. "No matter what you do, don't let him focus Katsuki," he thought to himself. Izuku in any other situation probably would have grinned at his friend for noticing something like that. He needed time to think and analyze to be at his best. He needed to be focused to use his ESP. Bakugo was making his life a lot harder than it should have been. Rather than the barrage of clumsier explosions he'd used the first time they fought, each one the blonde sent forward was well-placed and precise. Midoriya actually found himself struggling as his best friend came at him, quite literally blazing. Izuku tried to get in close and go on the offensive. This made Bakugo grin as before. He'd always been evasive, choosing to just dodge rather than attack. It meant something had changed. If Bakugo could win that small battle, he was sure as hell going to carry on winning until he took the whole damn war. Midoriya again tried to stifle his laughter at Bakugo's thoughts as he fainted before punching Bakugo in the stomach. The blonde doubled over, but thinking fast, he collapsed to the ground and rolled, avoiding Izuku's next strike. The greenette gave a small huff of frustration which made Bakugo smirk as he jumped to his feet, immediately carrying on his attack with a left hook, forcing Izuku to dodge right. Bakugo stuck his foot out in an attempt to trip him, but Izuku hopped over it, only minutely aware of how he was being backed into a corner. Bakugo kept on the onslaught, and Midoriya couldn't help but admire how much better he'd gotten since the first time they'd fought. He must have been working really hard, he mused to himself. "You bet I've been working hard, nerd. How else am I supposed to be the #1 hero?" Bakugo yelled as he sent forward an explosion and kicked his legs, very nearly ripping them out from under him. "Oh, I said that out loud, didn't I?" Izuku thought as he stumbled backwards slightly unsteadily. His back hit the wall. Well, sugar, Izuku thought, looking warily at Bakugo, who grinned his evil grin, hands crackling with explosions. Either I end you right here, Zucken, or you use your goddamn quirk, choice is yours. The proud grin was basically splitting the blonde boy's face. Izuku had been about to consider his options and think it through when Bakugo had given him a knowing look and sent a bigger explosion straight for his face. The searing heat made his skin feel like it was burning, and the pressurized air tousled his hair, stinging his eyes as the blast came way too close to him for comfort. In the spur of the moment, Izuku shut his eyes and made his decision. The blast left a decent-sized hole in the wall where Izuku had been seconds earlier. That's more like it, you damn nerd. I knew you wouldn't be stupid enough to just stand there and take it. Bakugo laughed. Izuku felt mildly proud of Bakugo for actually getting him to use his quirk, but now that he'd done it once, he decided he wasn't going to go easy on him. Kaken, you wanted to see my quirk so badly that you managed to back me into a corner. You better get ready for what's coming to you, Izuku yelled, and Katsuki just laughed. Oh hell yes, you're going down. Bakugo began to charge once again, only to have an emerald green aura surround him. He looked at Izuku and obviously his eyes were glowing toxically. Well shit, Katsuki thought as Izuku chucked him into the ceiling before throwing him left and right into the walls as if he were a toy. For most people, that attack in itself could have easily been AK.0, but Bakugo was able to use his explosions to slightly cushion each crash. Izuku sent him up towards the ceiling again, and the aura around him disappeared as he hurtled towards the ground. He barely managed to save himself from becoming a pancake. Damn Zucken, you could have ended me. He mentally screamed. Stop being overdramatic, Kaken. There's no way a fall like that would have ended you. Sorry though. He laughed. Bakugo's eyes turned to saucers as he looked at Izuku, and Izuku, realizing his mistake, covered his mouth, barely muffling a squeak as he telekinetically flung Bakugo into a wall in a slight panic. Bakugo, having been prepared for this, rather than slamming into the wall, pivoted in midair using his explosions and then kicked off of the wall, racing back towards Izuku. So you've been listening in to my damn thoughts this whole time, you nerd. And no wonder you were finding it so easy to dodge me. He shrieked mentally, waiting to see if Izuku reacted in any way. When the greenette flinched ever so slightly, he knew it was the truth and growled as he tried to clear his head. It didn't exactly work, so he did the next best thing, something he did so often it was second nature. He let the crimson cloth of rage cover his mind. Die you of Deku, he screeched as he kicked where Izuku had been standing a split second ago. Feeling something on his left, he dodged the fist which'd been about to connect with his nose with scarily fast reflexes. How close Izuku had been only pissed him off more, and the explosions getting louder in his hands proved it. Kaken, relax. Midoriya stuttered. Though Izuku was confident in his abilities, he was still anxious. An angry Bakugo was an unpredictable and dangerous Bakugo after all. Bakugo's reply was a wordless scream of irritation as he came shooting like a bullet once again. Midoriya sighed exasperatedly, teleporting again and using his psychic constructability to create a bow staff. Look, is that what you wanted? There, Kaken, that's a psychic construct. He yelled at his friend as he batted him away from himself. Bakugo no longer seemed to care. Will hot sauce fix it? Izuku wondered aloud as Bakugo came, roaring at him again. The boy seemed to have forgotten fatigue was supposed to be a thing. Izuku breathed out, creating an illusion. The walls around them became shelves stacked with hot sauce bottles, and Izuku created a construct of the spiciest type which he hesitantly offered as a peace offering. Again Bakugo didn't seem to care. The construct was sent flying and the illusion dissipated as he blazed straight through it. At this point Izuku was starting to truly feel worried. Hey Kaken, you're right, I was reading your thoughts. Please calm down now, he mentally begged. Get the F out of my head. Bakugo screamed at him. Izuku teleported again and again as the blonde sent more explosions at him. He'd gotten hit a couple of times as in his situation it was very hard to focus. Even in his rage Bakugo wasn't letting Midoriya think. When Izuku tried to listen into Bakugo's thoughts he heard nothing. When he tried to actually visualize his friend's thoughts, all he saw was an endless sea of red. When he tried to keep him away telekinetically Bakugo would use his explosions to come back stronger. Fire was definitely a big no around Katsuki. He carried on, using more of his abilities and creating new combos in his attempt at keeping Bakugo from killing him. He was fairly sure his best friend was trying to end him for real this time. He had end written all over his face. Izuku was struggling to keep Katsuki's rage from influencing him due to empathy. The longer they fought, the harder he found it becoming. The rage was way too similar to that day. If he succumbed to it, he had no clue what would happen. All he knew was that there'd be chaos. Izuku, in a ditch attempt which he should have tried earlier, focused on Katsuki and tried to brainwash him, thinking it would be as easy as it had been with the people before him. One thing he'd underestimated was just how much willpower the blonde had. Despite the fact he had no idea Izuku was trying to brainwash him, he still fought back with a mad ferocity. Izuku had to let go, losing the mental tug-of-war to dodge the boy in the real world. Now he was panicking. He could leave, but he really couldn't just leave. What was he even supposed to do with something like this? Psy. He was going to use Psy. How hadn't he thought to do that before? He probably would have berated himself for a while if Bakugo hadn't stuck his hand out in another attempt to blow his face off, which he narrowly dodged. He tried his best to gather his thoughts and form a blast. Usually, with how scattered they were, the orb of psychic power between his hands would be pathetic, but his strong emotions and panic ramped it up, making it grow a huge amount. He drew his hands back before mentally pushing the energy straight towards his best friend, all the while mentally apologizing. Bakugo gasped as the blast of energy hit him, knocking him to the ground. Izuku had hoped Katsuki had been knocked out and he could just carry him home, but nope, that was too much to ask for. Bakugo was slumped against the wall, still awake somehow and glaring endlessly, though he didn't have the strength to stand again. "I'll end you," he said darkly. Izuku watched in horror as Bakugo lifted both his arms, palms facing up towards the ceiling. The air was heating up at a rapid rate and it didn't seem to be stopping, getting hotter and hotter. The explosion Bakugo was forming was ginormous, bigger than the one at the park had been. If he was to set it off and the explosion itself didn't end them both, the building collapsing on top of them as a result of it certainly would. "Kaken, are you flipping crazy? What are you, idiot?" Izuku screamed. He wasn't sure if it was Bakugo's rage or his fear fueling him, but he dashed towards Bakugo, rapidly considering his options. Teleporting by himself? No, Bakugo would accidentally end himself. Teleporting just Bakugo? No. Some poor passerby and his best friend would probably die. Teleporting them both? No, they both die as well as some other people. Fight him? No, not enough time. Brainwash him into stopping? No, he's too darn stubborn. Izuku felt like screaming and he could feel his danger sense screaming at him. This is a threat, but he for once had no other bright ideas, so he carried on running towards his friend like his usually logical brain, which was being crazily illogical, told him to. Izuku reached Katsuki and extended his hand towards his friend. The second his fingers brushed the boy, his eyes rolled back and his body went limp, unconscious. Izuku had no idea what he'd just done, but he had no time to celebrate it. As he'd made it, Bakugo had let the explosion rip. Izuku could feel the heat of it scorching him. There'd probably be burn marks. Thankfully it hadn't been aimed directly at him. Izuku came to the conclusion that was because Katsuki couldn't get a clear shot slumped on the ground. It had been aimed up and the ceiling was already rapidly collapsing, large pieces of rubble falling way too close to them. A few seconds and Izuku would bet the whole place would collapse. Taking that thought as initiative, he grabbed the body of his unconscious friend and felt the now familiar pull of falling through space as he teleported directly to his room. Once they arrived, he set Katsuki on his bed to rest and stalked over to the bathroom where he lay on the ground for the better part of 2 hours having a small existential crisis. Having done that, he patched himself up and returned to his room. Bakugo was still passed out. Izuku sighed, grabbing the chair from his desk and sitting by his bedside. There was a long silence in which Izuku took the time to just frown disappointedly at Katsuki before he sighed in defeat. "Kaken, you're amazing, but that's got to be the most stupid thing you've ever done. You can't be so determined to win that you let your anger get outright end us. You could have ended us both." He spoke to the other boy despite the fact he probably couldn't hear him. "I'm never fighting you again, you idiot," he huffed. "But I guess today was your win. You finally got me to use my quirk, more than I ever have against anyone else in fact. You've improved so much since our first spar, so, well done I guess Kaken. If it wasn't completely and utterly illogical, Izuku could have sworn he saw his best friend's lips twitch into a very small smile.